Part 1. The Weight of Existence. The alarm pierces through the morning silence at 6:30 a.m. Your hand reaches out instinctively, fumbling across the nightstand to silence the mechanical demand. For a moment, you lie there in a half-light, caught between sleep and wakefulness, and in that liminal space, a question surfaces unbidden. What's the point? It's Monday again. Another week stretches ahead with its familiar rhythms. The commute, the meetings, the small talk by the coffee machine, the evening ritual of Netflix and dinner, the weekend reprieve that feels too brief, and then Sunday's creeping anxiety as Monday approaches once more. You know this pattern intimately. We all do. It's the texture of modern life, unremarkable in its repetition. Yet somehow, in the quiet moments before the day begins, it can feel crushingly heavy. This isn't depression exactly, though it might wear depression's clothes. It's something more fundamental, more universal. It's the weight of existence itself. That peculiar burden of being a conscious creature in what often seems like an indifferent universe. You're not alone in feeling it. In bedrooms across the world, millions of other people are experiencing the same Monday morning moment, the same quiet questioning that comes when the mind isn't yet busy enough to avoid its deeper concerns. The weight has many faces. Sometimes it's the overwhelming sense of responsibility for your family, your work, your future, your past decisions. Sometimes it's the fear of meaninglessness, the suspicion that despite all our activity and ambition, we're ultimately just sophisticated animals going through elaborate motions on a small planet in a vast, uncaring cosmos. Sometimes it's simply exhaustion, not physical tiredness, but a weariness of the soul that no amount of sleep can cure. This feeling isn't new, of course. Humans have been carrying this weight for millennia. The ancient Greeks had a word for it, aestia, a kind of spiritual listlessness. Medieval monks wrote about it as a noonday demon that made even prayer feel pointless. In the 19th century, philosophers began calling it existential anxiety, and by the 20th century, writers and thinkers were exploring what they termed the human condition, that fundamental predicament of being conscious beings trying to make sense of existence. But there's something particularly acute about how this weight manifests in our contemporary world. We live longer than any generation in history, yet often struggle to know what to do with all those extra years. We have more choices than ever before, yet frequently feel paralyzed by possibility. We're more connected globally than any previous civilization, yet loneliness has become an epidemic. We have access to more information than any human who came before us, yet wisdom seems scarce. The weight of existence in the 21st century often includes a specific kind of vertigo, the sense that we're living in accelerated times where change happens so rapidly that it outpaces our ability to find stable meaning. Our grandparents might have found their identity and purpose in religion, community, or family traditions that seem permanent. We, by contrast, live in a world where everything feels provisional, subject to disruption, where even our most basic categories, work, relationship, identity, truth itself, seem constantly in flux. And yet, we rarely talk about this weight openly. We become skilled at masking it, at presenting curated versions of ourselves that suggest we have it all figured out. Social media amplifies this tendency, encouraging us to broadcast our highlights while keeping our existential questions private. We learn early to respond to "how are you?" with "fine," even when we're carrying profound uncertainties about the meaning and direction of our lives. The silence around these questions can make the weight feel even heavier. When we don't speak about the fundamental challenges of human existence, we can begin to think we're the only ones experiencing them. The mother who loves her children deeply, but sometimes lies awake wondering if her life has become too small. The successful professional who feels like an imposter going through the motions of a career that seems increasingly hollow. The young person facing endless choices but feeling paralyzed by the absence of a clear path forward. Each person carrying their private burden of questions that seem too large for casual conversation. This is where Albert Camus enters our story, not as another voice adding to the weight, but as someone who found a way to carry it differently. Born in Algeria in 1913, Camus lived through some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. He experienced poverty, war, occupation, resistance, and the constant shadow of his own mortality through tuberculosis. He witnessed humanity's capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and remarkable beauty. Through all of this, he developed philosophy that many find surprising. He learned to find joy in existence without requiring it to make ultimate sense. Camus is often mischaracterized as a philosopher of despair, someone who reveled in meaninglessness and promoted nihilistic indifference. Nothing could be further from the truth. While he refused to offer false comfort or easy answers to life's fundamental questions, he also refused to surrender to despair. Instead, he developed what might be called a philosophy of lucid hope, a way of living that acknowledges the weight of existence while finding reasons to celebrate life anyway. The key insight that Camus offers isn't that life is meaningless, but that our hunger for absolute meaning might be misplaced. He suggests that we've been asking the wrong question. Instead of demanding what's the ultimate point of life, we might ask, how do we live fully within the conditions we actually face? Instead of seeking cosmic justification for our existence, we might focus on creating immediate, tangible value through our choices and actions. This shift in perspective doesn't eliminate the weight of existence. Camus was too honest for such false promises. But it does transform how we carry that weight. Rather than being crushed by unanswerable questions, we can learn to dance with them. Rather than being paralyzed by the absence of ultimate meaning, we can discover the freedom that comes from creating our own significance moment by moment. Consider that Monday morning alarm again. In Camus' framework, you don't need to wake up with a cosmic purpose to justify getting out of bed. You don't need to believe that your work contributes to some grand narrative of progress, or that your relationships are ordained by fate, or that your life fits into some predetermined plan. Instead, you can choose to rise because you're curious about what today might bring, because you want to taste your morning coffee, because you care about the people in your life, because you find something beautiful in the simple act of being conscious and present in the world. This might sound like settling for less, but Camus would argue it's actually asking for more honesty about the human condition, more attention to immediate experience, more appreciation for the remarkable fact that we exist at all in a universe that doesn't require our existence. The weight doesn't disappear, but it becomes workable, even potentially joyful. The question that frames everything that follows is deceptively simple. What do we do when life feels meaningless? Not how we find a meaning that must surely be hidden somewhere, but what do we do when we honestly confront the possibility that ultimate meaning might be a category error, a question we're not equipped to answer because we're asking something the universe isn't designed to provide? Camus' answer, developed over the course of his novels, essays, and plays, is both radical and practical. We learn to live without appeal to higher authorities or ultimate justifications. We learn to find sufficient reasons for living in the living itself. We learn to rebel against despair not by finding final answers, but by refusing to let unanswerable questions defeat our capacity for engagement, creativity, solidarity, and joy. This isn't easy wisdom. It requires a fundamental shift in how we approach the weight of existence. But for those willing to make that shift, Camus offers something precious. A way to be fully human without requiring the universe to validate our humanity. A way to find morning worth rising to meet, especially when we can't answer all the questions that the morning brings. The alarm sounds again. Tomorrow and the day after that. But perhaps, with Camus as our guide, we can learn to hear in that sound not just another demand to endure, but an invitation to live fully, honestly, and with whatever joy we can create along the way. Part 2. The absurd condition. Imagine standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon at sunrise. The silence is profound, not the absence of sound, but something deeper, more fundamental. You cup your hands around your mouth and shout into that vast space. Why am I here? What's the point of all this? What am I supposed to do with my life? Your voice echoes off the canyon walls, bounces between the ancient rock formations, and then fades into silence. The canyon offers no response. The rising sun continues its indifferent arc across the sky. The earth spins on without acknowledging your question. This is what Albert Camus called the absurd. Not a philosophical abstraction, but the most concrete experience imaginable. It's a collision between two undeniable realities. Our deep, almost desperate need for meaning, purpose, and understanding, and the universe's profound silence in response to that need. We are meaning-seeking creatures living in what appears to be a meaning-neutral cosmos, and this fundamental mismatch creates what Camus identified as a defining condition of human existence. The absurd isn't a problem to be solved so much as a condition to be recognized. It's not something that happens to us occasionally, like a bad day or a period of confusion. It's the permanent backdrop of human consciousness, the stage on which all our hopes, fears, ambitions, and relationships play out. We are creatures who cannot help but ask why. Living in a universe that cannot answer. To understand the absurd more clearly, consider the story of Maria, a brilliant cancer researcher who has dedicated her life to finding cures for childhood leukemia. She works 16-hour days, sacrifices personal relationships, pours her intelligence and passion into her research. She saves lives. Dozens of children who go home to their families because of her work. By any reasonable measure, Maria's life is meaningful, purposeful, valuable. But late at night in her laboratory, surrounded by the familiar hum of equipment and the sterile smell of chemicals, Maria sometimes stops and asks herself, but what's the point, really? She knows her work matters to the children she saves and their families. She knows it advances human knowledge and reduces suffering. But in the larger scheme of things, in the context of a universe that is 13.8 billion years old and contains more than 1 trillion galaxies, what does her work ultimately mean? Will any of it matter in 100 years? 1,000? When the sun eventually dies and takes Earth with it, what lasting significance will any human achievement have? This isn't Maria being pessimistic or having a crisis of faith. She's experiencing the absurd, the recognition that even our most meaningful activities exist within a framework that offers no ultimate justification for their meaning. The absurd is what happens when our human-scale values meet cosmic-scale indifference. Or consider David, a father watching his 4-year-old daughter chase soap bubbles in the backyard. She laughs with pure delight as each bubble floats away and pops. In that moment, David feels an overwhelming love for his child and a deep sense that this moment is precious, significant, worth preserving forever. But immediately afterward, he's struck by the realization that his daughter will grow up, that he will age and die, that eventually no one will remember this moment or the love he feels. The preciousness doesn't disappear. If anything, it becomes more intense, but it exists without any cosmic validation or permanent significance. The absurd emerges from this gap between what we need from existence and what existence actually provides. We need our lives to matter in some ultimate sense. We need our choices to have lasting significance. We need our suffering to serve some greater purpose, our love to connect us to something eternal, our achievements to contribute to some grand narrative of progress or meaning. But when we look honestly at our situation, we find ourselves in a universe that appears fundamentally indifferent to these needs. This indifference isn't malicious. The universe isn't actively hostile to human meaning. It's more profound than hostility. It's the absence of any framework within which our questions about ultimate meaning even make sense. It's like trying to ask a rock about justice or querying a tree about the stock market. The categories simply don't apply. Throughout history, humans have developed various strategies to avoid confronting this fundamental mismatch. Religion offers one of the most common escapes from the absurd by providing cosmic meaning and eternal significance for human existence. If God has a plan, if there's an afterlife, if our souls are immortal and our actions have consequences that extend beyond death, then the gap between our need for meaning and the universe's silence gets filled. Our lives matter because they're part of a divine narrative that gives ultimate significance to even the smallest human gesture. Camus understood the appeal of religious solutions, but he found them intellectually dishonest, not because he could disprove the existence of God or definitively rule out an afterlife, but because these beliefs seemed to him like attempts to escape from the human condition rather than fully inhabit it. They required what he called a leap of faith, a decision to believe something not because evidence compelled belief, but because the alternative was too difficult to bear. Political ideologies offer another common escape from the absurd. If history has a direction, if human society is progressing towards some ultimate goal, whether that's the classless society of communism, the perfect market of capitalism, or the rational democracy of liberalism, then individual lives gain meaning through their contribution to this larger historical project. Your suffering today makes sense if it's helping to build a better tomorrow for all humanity. But Camus lived through the rise of fascism, the horrors of World War II, and the early decades of the Cold War. He saw how easily grand historical narratives could be used to justify enormous cruelty. He witnessed how political movements that promised ultimate meaning often ended up crushing individual human beings in service of abstract ideals. The 20th century provided ample evidence that history might not have a direction after all, that human progress was far from guaranteed, and that political solutions to existential problems often created new and worse forms of suffering. Even secular forms of hope struck Camus as potentially problematic. The belief that science will eventually answer all important questions, that human reason will ultimately solve all problems, that future generations will look back on our current difficulties as primitive concerns. These optimistic narratives might provide comfort, but they also require a kind of faith that Camus found suspect. They ask us to bet our lives on outcomes we can't guarantee, to find meaning in hypothetical futures rather than present realities. The problem with all these escapes, in Camus' view, isn't that they're necessarily false, though he suspected many of them were, but that they prevent us from fully confronting and embracing our actual situation as human beings. They offer us ways to avoid the absurd rather than ways to live authentically within it. But here's where Camus' insight becomes truly radical. He suggests that the absurd is not actually the problem. The problem is our desperate attempts to escape from it, our refusal to accept it as a fundamental condition of human existence. Like someone struggling frantically in quicksand, our efforts to escape the absurd often make our situation worse by preventing us from learning to work skillfully within constraints we actually face. Consider what happens when we try to deny the absurd. We might throw ourselves into work with such intensity that we don't have time to ask larger questions about meaning. We might pursue pleasure or distraction so relentlessly that we never have to sit with the silence. We might become so busy building our careers, raising our families, accumulating experiences or possessions, that we never pause long enough to feel the way of existence we explored in part one. Or we might go in the opposite direction, becoming paralyzed by the recognition that nothing ultimately matters, sinking into nihilism or cynicism, giving up on engagement with life because engagement seems pointless. We might become so focused on the absence of ultimate meaning that we lose sight of immediate meaning, so concerned with cosmic significance that we ignore the significance available in the present moment. Both responses, frantic avoidance and nihilistic surrender, miss what Camus sees as the authentic human possibility. To live fully and passionately within the absurd condition, neither denying it nor being crushed by it. This requires a fundamental shift in perspective, a willingness to find the absurd not tragic but liberating. The liberation comes from recognizing that if the universe doesn't provide ultimate meaning, then we're free to create immediate meaning. If there's no cosmic purpose to discover, then we're free to choose our own purposes. If there's no eternal significance to our actions, then we can focus on their temporal significance, their impact on ourselves, our loved ones, our communities, our moment in history. The person shouting into the canyon doesn't receive an answer, but the act of shouting is itself a form of rebellion against the silence. The question doesn't get resolved, but the questioning reveals something essentially human. Our refusal to accept indifference passively, our insistence on asserting meaning even when meaning isn't guaranteed. Camus invites us to imagine what might happen if we stopped demanding that the universe validate our existence and started validating ourselves. What if we could learn to live without cosmic reassurance? What if we could find the strength to create value without eternal guarantees? What if we could love, work, play, and struggle with full intensity, while acknowledging that these activities exist within a framework that offers no ultimate justification for their importance? This isn't a recipe for despair, but for a particular kind of freedom. The freedom that comes from no longer needing the universe's permission to find life worth living. The absurd, properly understood, isn't the enemy of human flourishing, but potentially its foundation. It's the clearing away of false hopes and impossible demands that make space for authentic engagement with the life we actually have. The canyon still doesn't answer when we shout into it, but perhaps, Camus suggests, we can learn to love both the shouting and the silence, to find in that very combination something worth celebrating. The echo of our own voice returning to us might be answer enough. Part 3. The suicide question. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. These are the opening words of Albert Camus' masterwork, The Myth of Sisyphus, and they have probably startled, disturbed, or even offended more readers than any other sentence in modern philosophy. Here is a writer, at the very beginning of his most important philosophical treatise, placing the question of suicide at the center of human existence. Not love, not meaning, not happiness, not truth, but the decision of whether to continue living at all. At first glance, this seems morbid, even dangerous. Why begin a philosophical exploration with the darkest of human possibilities? Why make the choice between life and death the foundation of all other philosophical inquiry? The answer reveals something profound about Camus' approach to authentic living. He believed that until we honestly confront the possibility of not existing, we can never fully embrace the reality of existing. The suicide question isn't meant to promote self-destruction or normalize thoughts of ending one's life. Instead, it's meant to strip away all the comfortable assumptions and inherited beliefs that usually prevent us from examining life directly. Most of us live as if continuing to exist were automatic, inevitable, or obviously justified. We wake up each morning without consciously choosing to be alive. We simply find ourselves thrust into another day. But Camus asks us to consider, what if that assumption of life's value isn't automatic? What if we had to justify to ourselves why we choose to continue existing? This question becomes particularly acute when we fully absorb the implications of the absurd condition we explored in Part 2. If the universe offers no ultimate meaning, if our deepest questions receive only silence in response, if our lives are brief flickers of consciousness in an indifferent cosmos, then why continue? What rational argument could we make for persisting in existence when existence itself seems to lack ultimate justification? Consider Elena, a philosophy graduate student who has spent years studying the great questions of human existence. She's read Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead, absorbed Sartre's insights about the fundamental groundlessness of human existence, confronted Darwin's revelation that humans are evolutionary accidents rather than special creations. The more she learns about the human condition from an objective, scientific perspective, the smaller and more insignificant human life appears. Late one evening in the university library, surrounded by thousands of books representing humanity's accumulated wisdom, she finds herself asking, if this is all there is, if we're just complex biological machines that evolved by chance on a tiny planet in a vast, indifferent universe, then what's the point of continuing this charade? Elena isn't suffering from clinical depression, though her question might sound like a symptom of mental illness. She's experiencing what Camus would recognize as a moment of philosophical clarity, the moment when all the comfortable illusions about life's inherent meaning or obvious value fall away, leaving her face to face with existence in its raw, unjustified state. She's arrived at what Camus called the absurd confrontation, the moment when we recognize the full implications of living in a universe that doesn't provide cosmic reasons for our existence. This confrontation happens to different people in different ways. For some, it comes during a period of loss, after the death of a loved one, the end of marriage, the collapse of long-held beliefs, or the failure of dreams they had built their identity around. For others, it emerges during moments of apparent success, when they achieve goals they thought would provide lasting satisfaction, only to discover that achievement feels hollow, temporary, insufficient to justify the struggle it required. Sometimes a confrontation happens suddenly, triggered by a specific event or realization. A person might be walking down a familiar street when they're suddenly struck by the strangeness of existence itself. The bizarre fact that they're a conscious being moving around on a spinning rock in space, participating in elaborate social rituals whose ultimate significance remains unclear. Other times it builds slowly, like water gradually seeping through a foundation until it becomes impossible to ignore. The suicide question forces us to acknowledge that continuing to live is actually a choice, perhaps the most fundamental choice we ever make. We tend to think of suicide as an aberrant choice made by people in extreme circumstances, but Camus suggests that the more fundamental mystery is why anyone chooses to continue living once they fully understand their situation. If life lacks cosmic justification, if suffering is inevitable, if death awaits everyone regardless of their achievements or failures, if the universe would continue spinning indifferently whether we exist or not, then what rational basis do we have for choosing existence over non-existence? The conventional answers to this question often rely on external authorities or future promises. We should live because God commands it, because we have duties to fulfill, because suicide would hurt our families, because tomorrow might be better, because human life has inherent value, because we might achieve something important before we die. But Camus found each of these answers problematic in its own way. They either appeal to beliefs that can't be definitively proven, God's existence, inherent human value, guaranteed future improvement, or they subordinate individual choice to external obligations, duty, social expectations, consequences for others. What Camus was looking for was a reason to live that didn't depend on unproven metaphysical claims or external validation, a reason that could survive the full recognition of the absurd condition. He wanted to find grounds for choosing life that remained solid even after we acknowledge that the universe doesn't require our existence or provide ultimate meaning for our activities. This search led him to a startling reversal of conventional thinking. Instead of seeing the absence of cosmic meaning as a reason for despair, he began to see it as a source of freedom. If the universe doesn't dictate the terms of existence, then we become free to set our own terms. If there's no predetermined purpose for human life, then we're free to create our own purposes. If death is inevitable and ultimate meaning unavailable, then we can focus on immediate meaning and present experience without needing cosmic validation. The suicide question thus becomes not a morbid preoccupation with death, but the foundation for authentic living. By honestly confronting the possibility of non-existence, we create space for a genuine choice to exist. By acknowledging that we don't have to live, we transform living from an automatic assumption into a deliberate commitment. This transformation has profound implications for how we approach daily existence. Consider how different your Monday morning might feel if you experienced getting out of bed not as an inevitable necessity, but as a choice you were making afresh each day. The alarm clock doesn't force you to rise. You could choose to stay in bed indefinitely, to opt out of the entire enterprise of participating in human society. But if you do choose to get up, to shower, to eat breakfast, to engage with other people and with the tasks that await you, then these become expressions of your fundamental decision to affirm existence despite its ultimate groundlessness. This is what Camus meant when he suggested that deciding to live becomes the first act of rebellion against meaninglessness. Rebellion, in this context, doesn't mean violent revolution or angry protest. It means a quiet but profound refusal to accept despair as the final word about human existence. It means insisting on the value of life, even when that value can't be proven or guaranteed. It means choosing engagement over withdrawal, activity over passivity, creation over destruction, connection over isolation. The rebellion is subtle but revolutionary. Instead of demanding that life justify itself to us, we begin to justify ourselves to life through the choices we make moment by moment. Instead of waiting for the universe to provide meaning, we start providing meaning through our actions, relationships, and commitments. Instead of requiring external validation for our existence, we validate our existence through the simple but profound act of continuing to exist with intention and awareness. This doesn't make the question of suicide disappear. It remains what Camus called the only truly serious philosophical problem, because it forces us to examine the foundations of all our other commitments and beliefs. Why do we work toward goals if achievement is temporary? Why do we form relationships if separation is inevitable? Why do we create anything if destruction ultimately claims everything? Why do we struggle against suffering if suffering is part of the human condition? Why do we seek knowledge if final answers remain elusive? The suicide question strips away easy answers to these fundamental questions and forces us to find better ones. Answers that can survive the recognition of life's essential absurdity. These better answers don't eliminate uncertainty or provide ultimate guarantees. Instead, they help us find ways to live fully and passionately within uncertainty, to create provisional meanings that don't require eternal validation, to love and work and play and struggle with complete intensity, while acknowledging that these activities exist within a framework of cosmic indifference. Maria, the cancer researcher from Part 2, might find that confronting the suicide question actually strengthens her commitment to her work, not because she discovers that her research has cosmic significance, but because she recognizes that choosing to continue her research becomes an expression of her fundamental choice to affirm life. The children she saves don't need cosmic justification to matter. They matter because she chooses to live in a way that makes their suffering significant to her. Her work becomes an act of rebellion against the indifference of a universe that permits childhood cancer to exist. David, watching his daughter chase soap bubbles, might find that the transience of the moment doesn't diminish its preciousness, but intensifies it. The fact that this moment will pass, that his daughter will grow up, that his own life is limited, doesn't make his love meaningless. It makes his choice to love a form of defiance against time and mortality. Every moment of attention he gives to his daughter becomes an assertion that conscious experience has value even when that value isn't eternal. The suicide question ultimately reveals that authentic living requires a kind of courage, not the dramatic courage of heroes in battle, but the quieter courage of choosing to participate fully in existence while acknowledging its ultimate groundlessness. It's a courage to create meaning without requiring that meaning to be permanent, to form attachments while knowing that loss is inevitable, to work toward goals while accepting that achievement is temporary, to care deeply about outcomes while acknowledging that outcomes are often beyond our control. This courage doesn't emerge from confident knowledge about life's meaning or purpose. Instead, it emerges from a kind of lucid hopelessness, the recognition that if we're going to live, we might as well live as fully as possible, not because fullness is guaranteed to matter ultimately, but because the choice to live fully is itself a form of meaning-making that requires no external justification. When Camus writes about suicide, he's not promoting self-destruction, but excavating the foundations of self-creation. He's asking us to consider what it would mean to choose life not because we have to, not because we've been told to, not because we're afraid not to, but because we want to, because we find something to experience being conscious, of loving and creating and struggling and questioning. That makes a choice to continue worth making again and again, day after day, morning after morning, alarm clock after alarm clock. The suicide question thus becomes not the darkest question we can ask, but the most illuminating one. The question that clears away everything inauthentic about our relationship to existence and leaves us face to face with the raw choice that makes everything else possible. The choice to live deliberately and without guarantee, in full recognition of both life's absurdity and its irreplaceable preciousness. In choosing to live, we don't solve the absurd condition, we inhabit it. We don't find ultimate meaning. We create immediate meaning. We don't escape the human predicament. We learn to dance with it. And in that dance, Camus suggests, we might discover something worth calling joy. Part 4. 3 responses to the absurd. When we truly confront the absurd condition, that fundamental mismatch between our need for meaning and the universe's silence, we find ourselves at a crossroads. The comfortable illusions have been stripped away. The easy answers no longer satisfy. The weight of existence presses down with full force, and we must choose how to respond. Camus observed that most people, when faced with this recognition, take one of 3 paths. They escape through hope, escape through reason, or escape through death. Each path offers temporary relief from the burden of absurdity, but each, in Camus' view, represent a form of philosophical suicide, a refusal to live authentically within the human condition. Escape through hope, the leap of faith. The first and perhaps most common response to absurdity is what Camus called the leap of faith, the decision to believe in something that transcends human understanding and provides ultimate meaning for existence. This hope takes many forms, but they all share a common structure. When faced with uncertainty and meaninglessness, the individual chooses to believe in a larger reality that makes everything make sense. Consider Sarah, a successful attorney who has always prided herself on rational thinking and evidence-based decision-making. In her professional life, she demands proof, questions assumptions, and builds arguments on solid logical foundations. But as she approaches 40, watching her parents age and confronting her own mortality, she begins to feel the weight of existential questions that her legal training cannot answer. What happens after death? Is there any ultimate justice in a world where good people suffer and bad people prosper? Does her work defending corporate clients really matter in any lasting sense? The uncertainty becomes unbearable. Sarah finds herself drawn to a local church, initially for the community and comfort provides, but gradually she begins to embrace beliefs that her rational mind cannot fully accept. She starts believing in an afterlife where ultimate justice prevails, in a divine plan that gives meaning to apparently meaningless suffering, in a loving God who cares personally about her struggles and choices. These beliefs provide enormous comfort and restore a sense of purpose to her life. From Camus' perspective, Sarah has made what Kierkegaard called a leap of faith, a decision to believe not because evidence compels belief, but because the alternative is too difficult to bear. This leap doesn't necessarily involve traditional religion. People make similar leaps when they embrace political ideologies that promise eventual human perfection, New Age spiritualities that guarantee personal transformation, or scientific materialism that confidently predicts humanity's ultimate triumph over all problems. The escape through hope can also take secular forms. Consider James, a climate activist who throws himself into environmental work with religious fervor. Despite overwhelming evidence that climate change is accelerating and that political and economic systems are failing to respond adequately, James maintains unwavering faith that humanity will eventually wake up and solve the crisis. He believes that his generation is living through a crucial turning point in history, that their sacrifices today will be remembered as heroic by future generations living in a sustainable utopia. James's hope is entirely unreasonable. Dramatic social changes have happened before, and technological breakthroughs remain possible. But Camus would note that James's commitment to optimism has become desperate, requiring him to ignore or rationalize away evidence that contradicts his hopeful narrative. James has made hope itself into a kind of religion, complete with its own faith requirements and denial of uncomfortable realities. The problem with escaping through hope isn't that hope is always wrong. Some hopes are fulfilled, some faiths turn out to be justified, some optimistic predictions prove accurate. The problem is that hope, when used as an escape from absurdity, requires us to base our lives on beliefs we cannot verify and outcomes we cannot guarantee. It asks us to live as if we knew things we don't actually know, to bet everything on possibilities that may never materialize. More fundamentally, the escape through hope prevents us from fully accepting and living within our actual human condition. Instead of learning to find value and meaning within uncertainty, we convince ourselves that certainty exists somewhere beyond our immediate experience. Instead of embracing the freedom that comes from the absence of predetermined meaning, we submit ourselves to authorities and narratives that promise to provide meaning from outside. Escape through reason, the system builders. The second common response to absurdity is the attempt to escape through reason, to construct comprehensive intellectual systems that explain everything and leave no room for uncertainty or meaninglessness. If the universe won't provide ready-made answers to our deepest questions, then perhaps human reason can construct those answers through careful analysis, systematic thinking, and the accumulation of knowledge. This escape appeals particularly to intellectual temperaments. Consider Dr. Peterson, a philosophy professor who has spent decades developing what he believes is a complete rational system for understanding reality. He has read everything, analyzed every argument, constructed elaborate theoretical frameworks that seem to account for every aspect of human experience. In his system, consciousness emerges from complexity, morality derives from evolutionary psychology, meaning arises from progressive development of rational understanding, and human suffering can be minimized through the proper application of reason to social problems. Dr. Peterson's system is impressively comprehensive and intellectually rigorous. He can explain why people suffer, how societies develop, what constitutes ethical behavior, and where human knowledge is headed. His students find his lectures compelling because he offers rational answers to questions that have tormented humanity for millennia. He seems to have solved the puzzle of existence through pure thinking. But Camus would recognize in Dr. Peterson's systematic philosophy another form of escape from the absurd. The professor has created a rational castle in the sky, an intellectual construction that provides the illusion of complete understanding while actually avoiding direct confrontation with the limits of human knowledge. His system works beautifully as long as he remains within its boundaries, but it requires him to ignore or explain away experiences that don't fit his theoretical framework. The escape through reason can also manifest in less academic forms. Consider Rachel, a data analyst who becomes obsessed with optimizing every aspect of her life through measurement and systematic improvement. She tracks her sleep patterns, monitors her productivity, analyzes her relationships through psychological frameworks, and makes all her decisions based on careful cost-benefit analysis. She believes that life's problems stem from insufficient information and inadequate systematic thinking. If she can just gather enough data and apply rigorous enough analysis, she can solve the puzzle of how to live optimally. Rachel's approach provides a comforting sense of control and progress. She can point to concrete improvements in her health, productivity, and happiness. Her life becomes a fascinating intellectual project, a problem-solving exercise that engages her analytical abilities and provides clear metrics for success. She has transformed the messy, uncertain business of being human into a manageable technical challenge. Both Dr. Peterson and Rachel are engaging in what Camus would call philosophical suicide. They're avoiding the fundamental uncertainty and groundlessness of human existence by constructing rational systems that promise complete understanding and control. These systems may work admirably within their own terms, but they require their creators to pretend that human reason is more powerful and comprehensive than it actually is. The problem isn't with reason itself, which Camus valued highly, but with the attempt to use reason as an escape from the limits of reason. Human understanding, no matter how sophisticated, eventually encounters questions it cannot answer and realities it cannot fully explain or control. The escape through reason requires us to ignore these boundaries, to live as if our intellectual constructions were complete and final rather than partial and provisional. Escape through death, the ultimate surrender. The third response to absurdity is the most direct. If life lacks meaning and existence is unbearable, then why not simply end it? This is a response Camus addressed directly with a suicide question, but deserves deeper exploration because it takes forms beyond literal self-destruction. The most obvious form of escape through death is physical suicide. The decision that life's burden has become too heavy to bear and that non-existence is preferable to continued existence. Camus understood the logic of this choice. If life truly is meaningless, if suffering is inevitable, if death awaits everyone regardless of their achievements or failures, then choosing the timing of one's exit might seem like the only authentic expression of human freedom. But Camus also recognized more subtle forms of escape through death, what we might call spiritual suicide or existential suicide. These involve killing not the body, but the part of ourselves that asks difficult questions, that feels a way of existence, that struggles with uncertainty and meaninglessness. Consider Michael, a middle-aged businessman who once had dreams of becoming an artist, but who has gradually surrendered those dreams to focus on financial security and social respectability. As the weight of existential questions began to press down on him in his 30s, Michael didn't choose literal suicide. Instead, he chose a kind of spiritual death. He numbed himself through work, consumption, routine, and distraction until he no longer felt the urgent questions that had once tormented him. Michael's days now follow a predictable pattern. Work, commute, television, sleep, repeat. He has enough money to be comfortable, enough social connections to avoid loneliness, enough activities to stay busy. He rarely thinks about deeper questions of meaning or purpose anymore. Not because he's found answers, but because he successfully killed a part of himself that asked those questions. He's achieved a kind of living death, biological existence without existential engagement. This form of escape through death can look like success from the outside. Michael appears to have his life together, to have made mature compromises and accepted adult responsibilities. But Camus would recognize in Michael's numbness a form of suicide, the killing of conscious engagement with the human condition in favor of unconscious participation in social routines. Another form of spiritual suicide involves the embrace of nihilism, the belief that if nothing ultimately matters, then nothing matters at all, even temporarily or personally. This response acknowledges the absurd condition, but responds with complete withdrawal from engagement. If the universe is indifferent, then why care about anything? If death makes all achievements meaningless, then why achieve anything? If suffering is inevitable, then why try to reduce it? Consider Lisa, a former idealist who had become completely cynical after years of political disappointment and personal loss. She recognizes that traditional sources of meaning are questionable, but instead of finding alternative sources of value, she has concluded that value itself is an illusion. She goes through the motions of living but invests nothing emotionally in her relationships, work, or activities. She has chosen existential death, the complete withdrawal of care and commitment from life. The escape through death, in all its forms, represents surrender to absurdity rather than a genuine engagement with it. Physical suicide eliminates the questioner along with the questions. Spiritual suicide eliminates the questions, while leaving the questioner to drift through an increasingly empty existence. Both responses avoid the challenge of learning to live fully, while acknowledging life's fundamental uncertainty. Why these escapes fall short. Each of these three escapes offers temporary relief from the burden of absurdity, but each also requires us to abandon something essential about authentic human existence. The escape through hope requires us to believe what we cannot know and to base our lives on unverifiable promises about reality. The escape through reason requires us to pretend that human understanding is complete and final when it is actually partial and provisional. The escape through death requires us to surrender the very consciousness that makes us human. All three escapes share a common flaw. They attempt to resolve the tension between human needs and cosmic indifference rather than learning to live creatively within that tension. They seek to eliminate absurdity rather than embrace it as a permanent condition of human existence. The escape through hope tells us that absurdity is temporary, that ultimate meaning exists and will eventually be revealed. The escape through reason tells us that absurdity is solvable, that human intelligence can eliminate uncertainty and provide complete understanding. The escape through death tells us that absurdity is unbearable, that conscious existence is not worth maintaining in the face of meaninglessness. But what if all three responses miss the point? What if absurdity is neither temporary, nor solvable, nor unbearable? What if it's simply the starting point for authentic human existence, rather than a problem to be escaped? This is where Camus' genius becomes apparent. Instead of trying to escape from the human condition, he began to imagine what it might mean to inhabit it fully, to live with intensity and passion precisely because life lacks ultimate justification, to create meaning precisely because meaning is not provided from outside, to rebel against indifference precisely because indifference is a fundamental condition we face. The fourth way. Camus found a fourth way, a response to absurdity that neither denies it nor surrenders to it, but instead transforms it into the foundation for an authentic and even joyful existence. This fourth way doesn't promise escape from the human condition, but offers a method for living fully within it. It doesn't eliminate uncertainty, but learns to find freedom in uncertainty. It doesn't discover ultimate meaning, but learns to create immediate meaning without requiring cosmic validation. This fourth way is what Camus called absurd life, a way of existing that acknowledges the fundamental mismatch between human needs and cosmic reality, while refusing to let that mismatch become either a reason for despair or an excuse for escape. It's a path that leads not away from the human condition but deeper into it, not toward false comfort but toward authentic engagement, not toward easy answers but toward more interesting questions. The absurd life requires a different kind of courage than any of the three escapes. It's the courage to live without guarantees, to love without assurance of permanence, to work without promise of ultimate significance, to create without expectation of eternal recognition. It's the courage to be fully human in a universe that doesn't require our humanity, to insist on the importance of consciousness in a cosmos that might be fundamentally unconscious. This fourth way doesn't emerge automatically from recognizing the inadequacy of the three escapes. It requires a fundamental shift in perspective, a willingness to see absurdity not as humanity's tragedy, but as its opportunity. It requires learning to find in the very groundlessness of existence a kind of freedom that none of the escapes can provide. In the parts that follow, we'll explore how this fourth way actually works in practice, how someone can live the absurd life without falling into despair or self-deception, how consciousness can become a source of joy rather than burden, how the recognition of mortality can intensify rather than diminish our engagement with existence. We'll discover how Camus transformed the philosophical problem of meaninglessness into a practical method for living with both lucidity and passion. The three escapes represent humanity's most common responses to existential crisis, but they are not the only responses available. There is another way, stranger, more difficult, but ultimately more authentic and even more joyful than any form of escape. It's the way of the absurd hero, and it begins with a simple but revolutionary decision: to live fully precisely because life cannot be fully justified. Part 5. The Absurd Hero. After rejecting the three common escapes from absurdity, hope, reason, and death, we arrive at what might seem like an impossible position. We cannot leap into faith because honesty prevents us from believing what we cannot know. We cannot construct comprehensive rational systems because reason has limits that reason itself reveals. We cannot surrender to death, literal or spiritual, because something in us rebels against surrender. So where does this leave us? This is where Camus makes his most radical and transformative move. Instead of seeing the rejection of all escapes as leading to despair, he sees it as leading to a new kind of freedom. Instead of viewing the impossibility of ultimate solutions as a dead end, he sees it as the beginning of authentic living. Instead of treating the absurd condition as humanity's curse, he begins to explore it as humanity's liberation. The person who chooses to live fully within the absurd condition, without escape or denial, becomes what Camus calls an absurd hero. This isn't heroism in the traditional sense. There are no dragons to slay, no kingdoms to save, no eternal glory to win. The absurd hero's battlefield is consciousness itself, and the victory isn't over external enemies, but over the temptation to flee from the human condition. The nature of absurd heroism. Consider Maya, a hospice nurse who has spent 15 years caring for dying patients. She has witnessed more human suffering than most people encounter in several lifetimes. She has held the hands of children dying from cancer, sat with elderly patients abandoned by their families, comforted people facing death with unfinished business and unresolved regrets. She has seen no evidence that suffering serves any cosmic purpose, no indication that death leads to anything beyond death, no sign that the universe cares about human pain or human love. Yet Maya continues her work not because she believes it serves some ultimate meaning, but because she chooses to make it meaningful through her commitment to it. She doesn't delude herself that her care will prevent death or that her compassion will be remembered eternally. She simply decides that in a universe that permits unnecessary suffering, her choice to reduce that suffering wherever possible is valuable. Not cosmically valuable, but immediately, tangibly, humanly valuable. Maya embodies the absurd hero because she lives fully within the contradiction of caring deeply about outcomes she cannot ultimately control, of creating meaning in a context that provides no guaranteed meaning, of asserting the value of consciousness in a universe that might be fundamentally unconscious. She neither escapes into false hope about afterlife rewards nor retreats into cynical indifference. Instead, she inhabits the space between hope and despair, finding in that space a kind of freedom that neither escape can provide. This freedom isn't the absence of constraint. Maya is deeply constrained by her patients' needs, by hospital policies, by her own mortality and limitations. Rather, it's freedom from a need for external justification. She doesn't need God's approval or society's validation or history's vindication to make her work worthwhile. The work justifies itself through her choice to find it worthwhile, moment by moment, patient by patient, shift by shift. The absurd hero doesn't overcome the absurd condition. That would be impossible. Instead, the absurd hero learns to dance with absurdity, to find in the very groundlessness of existence a kind of solid ground. This dance requires what Camus identified as three essential characteristics: revolt, freedom, and passion. Revolt, the refusal to surrender. When Camus writes about revolt, he doesn't mean political revolution or angry rebellion against specific injustices, though those might be expressions of the deeper revolt he has in mind. Instead, he means something more fundamental: the refusal to accept despair as a final word about human existence. Revolt, in this sense, begins with simple but profound recognition. The fact that life lacks ultimate meaning doesn't make life worthless. The absence of cosmic purpose doesn't eliminate the possibility of creating immediate purpose. The universe's indifference doesn't require our indifference. Consider David, whom we met earlier watching his daughter chase soap bubbles. David has fully absorbed the implications of mortality. He knows that he will die, that his daughter will die, that eventually no one will remember their names or their love for each other. This knowledge could lead him to conclude that his love is meaningless, that his attention to these precious moments is naive, that caring about temporary experiences is a form of self-deception. Instead, David chooses revolt. He refuses to let the temporary nature of love diminish love's immediate reality. He refuses to let the inevitable ending of consciousness invalidate consciousness's present value. He rebels against the logic that says, if it doesn't last forever, it doesn't matter, by insisting that temporary experiences can matter intensely precisely because they are temporary. This revolt isn't directed against death itself. David accepts that mortality is part of the human condition. Instead, it's directed against the tyranny of meaninglessness, against the demand that experiences justify themselves in terms of eternal significance before they can be considered valuable. David's revolt consists in living as if conscious experience has value even when that value cannot be proven or guaranteed. The revolt of the absurd hero is quiet but radical. It doesn't require dramatic gestures or public declarations. A teacher who continues to educate students with passion and care, fully aware that most of what she teaches will be forgotten, is engaged in revolt. A gardener who tends plants knowing that winter will kill them, finding satisfaction in the work of cultivation itself, is engaged in revolt. A parent who loves a child completely while acknowledging that protection is limited and loss is inevitable is engaged in revolt. This revolt becomes contagious in the most beautiful way. When people witness someone living with full engagement despite life's ultimate uncertainties, they're reminded that such engagement is possible. When they see someone creating meaning without requiring cosmic validation, they remember that they too have this capacity. The absurd hero's revolt against despair becomes an invitation for others to discover their own capacity for meaningful engagement within meaninglessness. Freedom. Liberation from false dependencies. The second characteristic of the absurd hero is a profound and liberating freedom. Not political freedom or social freedom, though those matter, but existential freedom. This is a freedom that comes from no longer needing life to be other than it is in order to find it worth living. Most of us live with elaborate dependencies on external circumstances for our sense of meaning and value. We need our work to be important, our relationships to be permanent, our achievements to be recognized, our suffering to serve some purpose, our beliefs to be validated by others or by events. These dependencies make us vulnerable to despair whenever external circumstances don't align with our requirements for meaning. The absurd hero discovers a different relationship to external circumstances. Consider Elena, the philosophy student we met earlier, who was struggling with the implications of existential meaninglessness. Instead of remaining trapped in despair or escaping into false solutions, Elena chooses a third path. She decides to continue her philosophical studies not because philosophy will eventually answer all questions, but because she finds the process of questioning inherently valuable. Elena stops needing philosophy to provide ultimate truth in order to find philosophical inquiry meaningful. She stops requiring her professors to have final answers in order to learn from their insights. She stops demanding that her dissertation contribute to eternal human knowledge in order to find satisfaction in the process of research and writing. She becomes free from the need for her intellectual work to be more than it actually is, a finite human being's attempt to understand her situation more clearly. This freedom doesn't make Elena indifferent to outcomes. She still hopes her work will be good, still cares about contributing to human knowledge, still wants to help her students think more clearly. But she no longer makes these outcomes prerequisites for finding her work worthwhile. The work has value because she chooses to value it, because she finds satisfaction in doing it well, because it represents her particular way of engaging with the mystery of existence. The freedom of the absurd hero extends to relationships as well. Consider Tom, who has learned to love without requiring love to be eternal. He doesn't love his partner less because he knows their relationship might end. He loves more intensely because he knows it's temporary. He doesn't withdraw care from his aging parents because he knows he'll lose them. He increases his attention because he knows their time together is limited. Tom has become free from what we might call the eternity requirement, the demand that experiences prove their permanence before they can be considered valuable. This freedom allows him to invest fully in temporary experiences, to care deeply about relationships that will end, to find meaning in activities that won't be remembered forever. Perhaps most importantly, the absurd hero becomes free from the need for external validation of their choices. They don't need God's approval, society's recognition, history's vindication, or the universe's confirmation to make their commitments meaningful. This freedom is terrifying. It places a full responsibility for creating meaning squarely on human shoulders. But it's also liberating. It means we're no longer dependent on external authorities to tell us what matters or how to live. Passion, the intensity of present living. The third characteristic of the absurd hero is passion, not romantic passion necessarily, though that might be included, but profound intensity of engagement with immediate experience. When we stop requiring life to justify itself in terms of ultimate meaning, we become free to experience life's immediate richness more fully. The person who needs their work to serve cosmic purpose might actually experience less satisfaction in daily tasks than the person who finds intrinsic value in doing work well. The person who requires their relationships to be eternal might be less present to their loved ones than the person who treasures each moment of connection precisely because it's temporary. Consider Dr. Martinez, a research scientist who has spent her career studying the behavior of a particular species of ant. From one perspective, her work might seem trivial. These ants will be extinct someday. The Earth will be consumed by the expanding sun. The universe itself might collapse or expand into cold emptiness. What cosmic significance can ant behavior possibly have? But Dr. Martinez has learned to find her work passionately engaging without requiring cosmic significance. She's fascinated by the intricate social structures these tiny creatures create, amazed by their problem-solving abilities, delighted by discoveries about their communication systems. She doesn't need her research to save the world or unlock universal truths. She finds it meaningful because consciousness encountering the complexity of life is inherently meaningful to her. Dr. Martinez's passion isn't naive. She understands the temporary nature of her work and the limited scope of its impact. But this understanding doesn't diminish her engagement. It intensifies it. Knowing that her opportunity to study these creatures is limited makes each discovery more precious. Understanding that her conscious attention to their behavior is a rare thing in the universe makes that attention feel more significant, not less. This passion extends to all aspects of the absurd hero's existence. Food tastes more vivid when you're not distracted by demands for eternal significance. Conversations become more engaging when you're present to them rather than focused on their lasting impact. Sunsets become more beautiful when you're not troubled by their temporary nature. Art becomes more moving when you don't require it to solve the problems of existence. The passion of the absurd hero isn't manic or desperate. It's a natural result of full presence to immediate experience. When consciousness isn't consumed with demands or ultimate justification, it becomes available for intense engagement with whatever is actually happening. The great transformation, the movement from seeking ultimate meaning to creating immediate meaning, represents perhaps the most significant transformation a human consciousness can undergo. It's a shift from asking, "Why am I here?" to asking, "What can I do with the fact that I am here?" It's a change from demanding, "What's the point of all this?" to declaring, "I will create points within this." This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't eliminate all existential anxiety. The absurd hero still faces moments of doubt, still experiences the weight of existence, still confronts the silence of the universe when asking ultimate questions. But these experiences no longer lead to paralysis or despair. Instead, they become opportunities for a renewed commitment to the choice to live fully within uncertainty. Sarah, the attorney who once escaped into religious faith, might eventually find herself in a different relationship to belief. Instead of requiring absolute certainty about God's existence, she might choose to live as if love and justice matter, while acknowledging that she cannot prove they matter cosmically. Her faith becomes less about absolute knowledge and more about a chosen commitment to values that can't be ultimately validated. Michael, who had chosen spiritual death through numbness and routine, might rediscover capacity for engagement without requiring guarantees about where that engagement leads. He might return to artistic impulses not because art will make him immortal, but because the process of creation connects him to something vital in himself and in the world. Even Lisa, who had retreated into nihilistic cynicism, might find a path back to care and commitment. She might begin to see that acknowledging the absence of ultimate meaning doesn't require abandoning all meaning, that recognizing the temporariness of value doesn't make temporary value worthless. The absurd hero represents a new model of human existence, not the person who has solved life's mysteries, but the person who has learned to live beautifully within mystery, not the individual who has eliminated uncertainty, but the one who has learned to dance with uncertainty, not the being who has transcended the human condition, but the one who has learned to inhabit that condition with grace, intensity, and joy. This heroism is available to anyone willing to make the fundamental shift from seeking ultimate justification to creating immediate value, from demanding cosmic meaning to making human meaning, from escaping the absurd condition to embracing it as the starting point for authentic existence. It requires no special talents, no extraordinary circumstances, no rare insights. only the courage to live fully within conditions that actually define human existence. The absurd hero doesn't overcome absurdity. Absurdity remains a permanent backdrop of human consciousness. But the hero transforms absurdity from a burden to be escaped into a freedom to be celebrated, from a problem to be solved into a condition to be inhabited, from humanity's curse into humanity's opportunity for authentic self-creation. Part 6. Sisyphus and the Art of Living. There's perhaps no image in all of literature more haunting than that of Sisyphus, the figure from Greek mythology condemned by the gods to push a massive boulder up a mountain for all eternity, only to watch it roll back down each time he reaches the summit, forcing him to begin again. The ancient Greeks created this myth to represent the ultimate punishment, a torture so complete and hopeless that it surpassed even the torments of hell. Yet Albert Camus, in one of philosophy's most audacious moves, transforms this image of cosmic punishment into a symbol of human liberation and even joy. To understand how Camus performs this transformation, we must first sit with the full weight of Sisyphus' situation. Picture the scene. A lone figure straining against an immense stone, muscles aching, breath coming in ragged gasps, sweat streaming down his face as he pushes his burden inch by inch up the steep mountain slope. Hours pass, perhaps days, as he slowly makes progress toward the summit. Finally, after tremendous effort, he reaches the top, only to watch helplessly as the boulder breaks free from his grasp and thunders back down the mountainside, coming to rest exactly where it began. And then, because this is his eternal punishment, Sisyphus must walk back down the mountain and begin again. The original myth, a portrait of futility. The ancient version of this story was meant to terrify. Sisyphus had been a clever king who tricked the gods themselves. He even managed to chain death and briefly escape his own mortality. But his cleverness ultimately backfired, and the gods devised a punishment that matched his crime of trying to transcend human limitations. They condemned him to a task that embodied perfect futility, endless labor with no possibility of completion, eternal effort with no achievement, perpetual struggle with no victory. The Greeks understood this as the ultimate nightmare. What could be worse than being trapped forever in meaningless repetition? What greater horror than to know that every ounce of effort would ultimately prove worthless? Sisyphus became their symbol for the kind of existence that makes death seem like a mercy, life stripped of purpose, progress, or hope. For centuries, Sisyphus remained exactly that, a figure of despair, a cautionary tale about the futility of human ambition in the face of divine power. Philosophers and poets invoked his image when they wanted to capture the essence of meaningless suffering. The boulder of Sisyphus became synonymous with any burden that must be carried without hope of relief. But Camus saw something different in this ancient story. Where others saw ultimate punishment, he began to glimpse ultimate liberation. Where others saw meaningless repetition, he discovered the possibility of meaningful choice. Where others saw cosmic cruelty, he found human opportunity. The crucial moment, the walk down. The key to Camus' revolutionary reading lies in a detail that most interpreters of the myth had overlooked: the walk down the mountain. In the traditional telling, we focus on Sisyphus' struggle up the slope, his straining muscles, his determined effort, his ultimate failure. But what happens in the moments after the boulder crashes back to the bottom? What occurs during Sisyphus' solitary walk down the mountain to begin again? It is during this descent, Camus suggests, that Sisyphus becomes most human and most free. The work is done, unsuccessfully as always, and the next round hasn't yet begun. In these moments between cycles, Sisyphus is alone with his consciousness, aware of his situation, confronting the full reality of his condition. He knows exactly what awaits him at the bottom of the mountain. He knows that his next effort will end exactly like all the others. He knows that tomorrow will be identical to today, and that this pattern will continue forever. These should be the moments of greatest despair. This is when Sisyphus should be crushed by the recognition of his eternal futility, when the weight of infinite repetition should become unbearable. Instead, Camus suggests these moments contain the seeds of liberation. Consider what Sisyphus knows during his walk down the mountain. He knows that the gods cannot make him push the boulder. They can condemn him to this task, but they cannot force him to approach it with despair. They can control his external circumstances, but they cannot dictate his internal response to those circumstances. In his mind, in his consciousness, in his attitude toward a situation. Sisyphus remains free. This freedom isn't the ability to escape his punishment. That remains impossible. Rather, it's the freedom to choose how to experience that punishment, how to understand his relationship to his labor, how to find meaning within constraints that define his existence. The radical reinterpretation. Here Camus makes his most audacious claim. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Not resigned, not stoically accepting, not grimly determined, but happy. This seems impossible, even obscene. How can someone condemned to eternal futility be genuinely happy? How can joy exist within perfect hopelessness? The answer lies in a fundamental shift in how we understand a relationship between happiness and achievement, between meaning and completion, between satisfaction and success. Camus suggests that we have been asking the wrong question about Sisyphus. Instead of asking, how can he bear this meaningless punishment? We should ask, what if the meaning isn't in completion, but in the doing? What if the value isn't in the achievement, but in the engagement? Imagine Sisyphus, during his walk down the mountain, beginning to understand the situation differently. Yes, he will never succeed in keeping the boulder at the summit, but success, he realizes, was never really the point. The point is the pushing itself, the engagement of his consciousness with a task, the investment of his energy in an effort, the choice to remain actively involved with his existence rather than withdrawing into passive despair. Consider Maria, whom we met earlier as a cancer researcher. Like Sisyphus, she faces a task that will never be truly completed. For every child she saves, others will die. For every breakthrough she achieves, new forms of cancer will emerge. Her boulder, the fight against disease and death, will never stay at the summit. Yet she might find profound satisfaction in the daily work of research, in the process of discovery, in the immediate impact of her efforts, without needing that work to achieve ultimate victory over mortality. Or consider David watching his daughter chase soap bubbles. He knows that this moment of joy will pass, that his daughter will grow up and face her own struggles, that all human happiness is temporary. His boulder is a task of creating meaningful moments within the inevitable passage of time. He will never succeed in making these moments permanent, but he can succeed in making them intensely present and deeply felt. The art of present living. Sisyphus, in Camus' interpretation, becomes a master of what we might call the art of present living, the ability to find complete engagement and satisfaction in immediate activity without requiring that activity to produce lasting results. This is radically different from how most of us approach our lives. We typically organize our existence around future payoffs. We work hard now, so we can be successful later. We save money now, so we can be comfortable in retirement. We exercise now, so we can be healthy when we're older. We sacrifice present experience for future achievement, current satisfaction for eventual reward. But what if this entire framework misses the point of existence? What if the value of work lies not in its ultimate products, but in the process of working? What if the meaning of effort exists not in its final results, but in the experience of effort itself? Sisyphus, having nothing to hope for in terms of future achievement, becomes completely available to present experience. The feel of the stone against his hands, the strain in his muscles, the rhythm of his breathing, the perspective from different points on the mountain, these immediate sensations and experiences become the entire content of his existence. And in focusing completely on what is rather than what might be, he discovers a form of satisfaction that doesn't depend on external validation or future reward. This doesn't mean that Sisyphus enjoys his punishment in a masochistic sense. The labor is still difficult, the boulder still heavy, the task still endless. But he learns to find within that difficulty something worth experiencing fully, the simple but profound fact that he is conscious, that he can engage with his circumstances, that his awareness can transform even punishment into a form of strange privilege. The democracy of struggle. Part of what makes Camus' vision so powerful is how universal it makes the Sisyphean condition. We are all in our own ways pushing boulders up mountains. The specific shape of our boulder varies. For some, it's the challenge of raising children who will eventually leave home. For others, it's building careers and industries that will eventually become obsolete. For others, it's maintaining relationships that will end in separation or death. For others, it's creating art that will likely be forgotten. The details differ, but the fundamental structure remains the same. We invest enormous energy in activities whose ultimate permanence or cosmic significance cannot be guaranteed. We love people who will die. We build things that will crumble. We solve problems that will be replaced by new problems. We learn skills that will become outdated. We fight for causes that may never be fully achieved. From one perspective, this universal Sisyphean condition might seem grounds to despair. Why do anything if nothing lasts? But Camus suggests the opposite conclusion. If we're all in the same situation, then we're all equally free to find meaning within that situation. The absurd condition isn't humanity's burden, but humanity's opportunity. Consider Janet, a teacher who has spent 30 years in public education. She has taught thousands of students, and she knows that most of them will forget much of what she taught them. Education reforms come and go, rendering obsolete the methods she spent years perfecting. Standardized tests don't capture what she considers most important about learning. Many of the problems she sees in her students' lives, poverty, family instability, social inequality, are beyond her power to solve. Yet Janet might find in her daily work the same satisfaction that Sisyphus finds in his. Each day brings new opportunities to connect with young minds, to spark curiosity, to provide encouragement, to model intellectual engagement. She doesn't need her impact to be permanent or her solutions to be complete. The value exists in the teaching itself, in the moment-to-moment experience of consciousness, encountering consciousness, of care expressing itself through attention and effort. The struggle is sufficient. This brings us to heart Camus' insight, captured in one of his most famous lines. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. Not the achievement of the heights, not the permanent possession of victory, not the guarantee of lasting meaning, but the struggle itself. This requires a fundamental redefinition of what it means for something to be enough. We usually think of activities as sufficient only if they lead to desired outcomes. Work is meaningful if it produces valuable results. Relationships are worthwhile if they provide lasting happiness. Creative efforts matter if they achieve recognition or influence. But Sisyphus teaches us a different calculus. The pushing is enough. Even without the permanent positioning of the boulder, the effort is sufficient, even without the guarantee of success. The engagement is worthwhile, even without the assurance of lasting impact. This isn't settling for less. It's discovering that we were asking for the wrong thing. We thought we needed our efforts to be validated by external results, when what we actually needed was to find our efforts intrinsically engaging. We thought we required cosmic significance when what we actually craved was immediate involvement. We thought we needed guarantees about the future when what we actually wanted was fuller presence in the present. Thomas, a social worker dealing with addiction and homelessness, might understand this distinction. He knows that many of the people he helps will struggle with their problems for years, that some will never achieve stable sobriety, that the social conditions that create homelessness are beyond his individual power to change. His boulder is the attempt to reduce human suffering in circumstances where suffering seems endemic. Yet Thomas might find his work deeply meaningful not because it solves everything, but because it allows him to engage daily with the dignity and resilience of human beings facing enormous challenges. Each person he helps represents not a permanent solution, but a temporary victory that is valuable precisely because it is temporary. Each small improvement in someone's life matters not because it lasts forever, but because it matters right now, to that person, in that moment. The joy of Sisyphus. When Camus writes that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, he isn't asking us to pretend that eternal punishment is actually wonderful. He's inviting us to consider what happiness might mean for someone who has learned to find satisfaction in process rather than product, in engagement rather than achievement, in presence rather than progress. This happiness isn't the giddy excitement of someone whose dreams are coming true. It's the deeper satisfaction of someone who has learned to dream different kinds of dreams, dreams that can be fulfilled in the living rather than in the achieving. It's the contentment of someone who has discovered that consciousness itself, when fully engaged, is a sufficient reason for gratitude. Sisyphus walks down the mountain each time with knowledge that would crush someone still dependent on hope for ultimate success. But this same knowledge liberates someone who has learned to find success in the walking itself, meaning in the consciousness that observes the walking, value in the choice to continue walking despite its ultimate futility. The boulder will always roll back down. The mountain will always demand to be climbed again. The task will always remain unfinished. But Sisyphus, and by extension, all of us, can learn to find in this very endlessness not punishment but opportunity, not futility but freedom, not curse but gift. In learning to imagine Sisyphus happy, we learn to imagine ourselves happy within our own Sisyphean circumstances. We discover that the art of living isn't the art of achieving permanent solutions, but the art of engaging fully with permanent questions. We realize that the struggle itself, when embraced with consciousness and choice, is indeed enough to fill a human heart. Part 7. Passion over Purpose. At 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, Sandra sits at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching steam rise from the dark liquid in spirals that catch the early light. Outside, the city is beginning its daily resurrection. The distant hum of traffic, the neighbor starting his car, the first birds announcing dawn. In this moment, Sandra isn't thinking about her project deadlines or her retirement savings or whether her life is contributing to human progress. She's simply present to the warmth of the cup in her hands, the bitter richness on her tongue, the way the morning light transforms her familiar kitchen into something almost sacred. This moment contains no cosmic significance. Sandra's coffee won't be remembered by history, won't solve any global problems, won't add to humanity's store of eternal wisdom. Yet something in this simple experience feels more valuable than all the grand purposes she's supposed to be pursuing. The taste is real in a way that abstract meaning never quite manages to be. The warmth is immediate in a way that future rewards never are. The presence is complete in a way that cosmic justification never can be. This is what Albert Camus meant when he suggested that we might choose passion over purpose, intensity over meaning, the fullness of immediate experience over the promise of ultimate significance. It's not that purpose doesn't matter. We'll explore in later parts how purpose can emerge from passion rather than preceding it. It's that we've gotten the relationship backward, searching for cosmic meaning to justify intense living when we might instead use intense living to create immediate meaning. The false promise of future fulfillment. Most of us live as if real satisfaction exists somewhere in the future, waiting to be claimed once we fulfilled certain conditions. We'll be truly content when we get the promotion, when we find the right relationship, when we achieve our goals, when we figure out our life's purpose, when we understand what it all means. The present moment becomes valuable primarily as a stepping stone toward future fulfillment rather than as a source of fulfillment in itself. Consider Mark, a 35-year-old marketing executive who has organized his entire existence around achieving what he calls work-life balance. He endures a job he finds increasingly meaningless because it will eventually provide enough financial security to pursue what he really loves. He postpones travel because he's saving for a house. He skips social gatherings because he's working toward a promotion. He hurries through meals because he has productivity goals to meet. He's living entirely in the future tense, banking present experience for later payoffs. But what Mark discovers, as many people do, is that the future keeps receding. Each achievement reveals new requirements for satisfaction. The promotion brings new pressures. The house requires maintenance that consumes the time he thought he'd gain. Financial security raises the bar for what counts as security. The work-life balance he's chasing remains perpetually just out of reach, always requiring one more sacrifice of present experience for future reward. Mark isn't living wrongly. Exactly. His approach might indeed lead to certain forms of success. But he's missing something that Camus would recognize as essential to human flourishing: the capacity to find immediate satisfaction in immediate experience, to discover richness in what's actually happening rather than in what might someday happen. The revolution of present attention, the shift from purpose to passion, requires what might seem like a simple change, paying attention to what's actually occurring in this moment rather than focusing on what should occur in some future moment. But this shift is actually revolutionary, transforming not just how we spend our time, but how we experience time itself. When Sandra pays full attention to her morning coffee, she's not just drinking a beverage. She's practicing a form of rebellion against the tyranny of the future. She's refusing to let this moment be valuable only as preparation for the next moment. She's insisting that present experience has sufficient worth to deserve her complete attention. This attention reveals richness that hurried, future-focused consciousness typically misses. The coffee isn't just caffeine delivery. It's a complex sensory experience involving smell, taste, temperature, texture. The kitchen isn't just a functional space. It's a small world of textures, colors, sounds, memories. The morning isn't just time to get through before the real day begins. It's life itself, happening at exactly the pace and in exactly the form that life actually takes. Consider how different Sanders' experience is from that of her neighbor Robert, who drinks his coffee while scrolling through news on his phone, mentally rehearsing his presentation for this afternoon, worrying about his mother's health, and planning his weekend. Robert's consciousness is everywhere except where he actually is. His coffee might as well be brown water. He's too distracted to taste it. His kitchen might as well be a hotel room. He's too preoccupied to see it. His morning might as well not exist. He's already living in projected versions of later today and next week. Robert isn't doing anything wrong by ordinary standards. He's being responsible, staying informed, planning ahead. But he's missing the actual texture of his existence in favor of abstract relationships to time and future possibilities. He's trading the richness of immediate experience for the anxiety of managing future scenarios. Mortality as intensifier. One of Camus' most profound insights is that awareness of mortality, rather than making life seem less valuable, can make present experience more intense and precious. When we truly absorb that our time is limited, that consciousness is temporary, that this particular configuration of awareness will someday cease to exist, ordinary moments can acquire extraordinary vividness. Consider Elena, the philosophy student who has learned to live within uncertainty rather than escaping from it. During her graduate studies, she developed a morning ritual. Before opening her books or checking her email, she spends 10 minutes simply observing whatever is visible from her apartment window. Some mornings it's rain creating patterns on the glass. Some days it's people walking to work, each absorbed in their private worlds. Sometimes it's just the way light moves across the building opposite hers. Elena doesn't engage in this practice because she believes window gazing serves some cosmic purpose. She does it because she knows that her capacity to see, to be conscious of seeing, to choose what she pays attention to, is temporary and therefore precious. The rain won't always be falling on this particular window. These particular people won't always be walking past. Her ability to witness these small dramas of ordinary existence won't last forever. This awareness doesn't make Elena melancholy. Quite the opposite. Knowing that her consciousness is finite makes her more grateful for having it at all. Understanding that these moments won't be repeated exactly makes them more vivid, more worth attending to completely. The temporariness doesn't diminish the experience. It concentrates it. This is what Camus meant when he suggested that mortality could become a source of intensity rather than despair. When we stop demanding that experiences last forever in order to be valuable, we become free to experience them fully while they're actually happening. When we stop requiring eternal significance as a prerequisite for attention, we can give our attention generously to temporary experiences. The democracy of small pleasures. The shift from purpose to passion doesn't require exotic experiences or extraordinary circumstances. In fact, it often reveals a richness hidden in experiences so ordinary that we usually overlook them entirely. The taste of bread, the feel of warm water, the sound of laughter, the sight of clouds moving across sky. These experiences don't need cosmic justification to be worthy of complete attention. They justify themselves through the simple fact of being vivid, immediate, and available to consciousness. Consider Amy, a nurse who works long shifts in a busy hospital. Her job is often stressful, sometimes heartbreaking, frequently overwhelming. But Amy has learned to find moments of intensity even within the most demanding days. The smile of a patient who's finally pain-free. The confidence she feels when starting a difficult 4 on the first try. The camaraderie with colleagues during a crisis. The way afternoon light falls across the nurse's station. The taste of cold water after hours of activity. Amy doesn't romanticize her work. She knows it's difficult, often thankless, sometimes tragic. But she's learned to notice and fully experience moments of satisfaction, connection, and simple sensory pleasure that occur even within challenging circumstances. These moments don't solve the larger problems of healthcare or eliminate the stress of her responsibilities, but they provide immediate experiences of aliveness, competence, and connection that don't require external validation to be meaningful. The passion Amy brings to these small experiences isn't separate from her professional competence. It enhances it. When she's fully present at starting in 4, she's more likely to succeed. When she's genuinely attentive to patient interactions, she provides better care. When she notices moments of beauty or connection, she becomes more resilient in the face of difficulty. Conversations as sacraments. Perhaps nowhere is the difference between purpose-driven and passion-driven living more apparent than in how we approach relationships and conversations. When we're focused on purpose, we often treat interactions with others as means to ends, networking opportunities, chances to gather information, ways to advance our goals or confirm our opinions. But when we're focused on passion and presence, conversations can become what we might call sacraments, moments of genuine meeting between conscious beings that are valuable in themselves. Consider the difference between two approaches to the same dinner party. Jessica arrives with a purpose-driven mindset. She wants to make professional connections, gather information about potential job opportunities, and present herself as knowledgeable and successful. She spends the evening strategically managing conversations, steering them toward topics that showcase her expertise, and evaluating each interaction for its potential utility. David arrives with a passion-driven mindset. He's curious about the people he'll meet, interested in perspectives different from his own, and genuinely attentive to whatever conversations develop naturally. He spends the evening fully present to whomever he's talking with, asking questions driven by genuine curiosity rather than strategic advantage, and sharing thoughts and experiences authentically rather than calculating their impression management value. Both approaches might lead to valuable outcomes, but they create entirely different qualities of experience. Jessica's evening is effortful and evaluative. She's working throughout, measuring each interaction against external criteria for success. David's evening is engaged and alive. He's playing rather than working, creating immediate value through authentic connection rather than accumulating future value through strategic positioning. The conversations David has don't need to lead anywhere specific to be worthwhile. They don't need to result in job offers or professional partnerships to justify the attention he gives them. They're valuable because conscious beings encountering each other with genuine interest is inherently valuable, because a meeting of different perspectives creates something that didn't exist before, because authentic human connection is one of the forms that life's intensity naturally takes. The art of savoring. Living with passion over purpose requires developing what we might call the art of savoring, the ability to extract maximum experience from whatever circumstances we actually find ourselves in rather than waiting for better circumstances that might permit greater satisfaction. Consider the difference between two people stuck in the same traffic jam. Michael treats a delay as an obstacle to his real life, which exists somewhere beyond this inconvenience. He spends the time in frustration, calculating how late he'll be, mentally rehearsing explanations for his tardiness, and planning alternate routes for future trips. The traffic jam is purely negative, time stolen from more valuable activities. Lisa treats the same delay as an unexpected gift of unscheduled time. She notices the way evening light illuminates the cars around her, observes the patience and impatience of fellow drivers, listens to music she rarely has time to hear completely, and allows her mind to wander in directions that her usually busy schedule doesn't permit. The traffic jam becomes an opportunity for a different kind of consciousness than her day typically allows. Lisa's approach doesn't eliminate the inconvenience of being late, and she's not pretending that traffic jams are preferable to free-flowing travel. But she's refused to let external circumstances entirely determine the quality of her experience. She's found ways to be present and engaged even within situations that seem to offer little opportunity for presence or engagement. This art of savoring becomes particularly important when we recognize that much of life consists of ordinary moments that don't seem to offer obvious opportunities for intensity or meaning. Waiting in line, commuting to work, doing laundry, grocery shopping, running errands. These activities won't appear in anyone's biography, won't be remembered as life's highlights, won't contribute obviously to cosmic significance, but they constitute the actual texture of daily existence. If we can't find ways to be present and engaged during ordinary time, We're essentially sleepwalking through most of our lives, staying conscious only for those rare moments that meet our criteria for being worth full attention. The practical wisdom of immediacy. The shift from purpose to passion carries with it a practical wisdom that transforms not just how we experience life, but how effectively we engage with life's challenges. When we're fully present to immediate experience, we often discover resources, opportunities, and solutions that distracted or future-focused consciousness typically misses. Consider how this plays out in creative work. Writers who sit down to create the great American novel often find themselves paralyzed by the gap between their grand ambitions and their immediate capabilities. But writers who sit down simply to write well today, to craft a sentence skillfully, to find the right word for this moment, to capture this particular observation clearly, often discover that good daily work accumulates into significant achievements. The same principle applies to learning, relationships, health, and virtually every aspect of human flourishing. Students who focus on truly understanding today's material, rather than worrying about final grades, often perform better on tests. People who give complete attention to current friendships, rather than strategizing about social networks, often develop richer relationships. Individuals who find ways to enjoy today's physical activity, rather than exercising primarily for future health benefits, often maintain more consistent and sustainable fitness practices. This isn't magical thinking. It's recognition that consciousness works best when it's fully engaged with present reality rather than divided between current experience and future projections. Presence enhances performance, attention improves outcomes, and engagement increases both satisfaction and effectiveness. Living for today's experiences. The practical wisdom that emerges from choosing passion over purpose can be summarized simply: live not for tomorrow's rewards, but for today's experiences. This doesn't mean abandoning planning or ignoring consequences or becoming impulsively irresponsible. It means recognizing that the quality of our planning, the wisdom of our decision-making, and the effectiveness of our responsibility all improve when we bring full presence to our current circumstances rather than treating them as obstacles to some imagined better future. When Sandra sits with her coffee each morning, she's not just practicing a pleasant ritual. She's training her consciousness in the art of presence that serves her throughout the day. When she's fully attentive to the coffee, she's more likely to be fully attentive to her work, her relationships, and her choices. The morning practice of savoring immediate experience becomes preparation for bringing that same quality of attention to whatever the day requires. This is Camus' great insight about the relationship between passion and purpose. When we learn to live with intensity and presence, purposes naturally emerge from that intensity rather than having to be imposed from outside. When we're fully engaged with our actual experience, we naturally begin to care about improving that experience. Not because we should, but because aliveness generates its own commitments. The absurd hero doesn't need cosmic purposes to justify intense living. Instead, intense living generates its own values, its own commitments, its own forms of meaning that don't require external validation. Purpose becomes not something we must discover or achieve, but something we naturally create through the simple but revolutionary act of paying complete attention to the life we're actually living, moment by moment, experience by experience, cup of coffee by cup of coffee. Part 8. Revolt as Affirmation. On a cold February morning in 1943, in Nazi-occupied France, Albert Camus sat in the editorial office of Combat, the underground resistance newspaper he had helped to create. Outside, the streets of Paris bore the symbols of occupation: German signs, military patrols, the constant presence of an ideology that reduced human beings to categories of worth and worthlessness. Inside, Camus and his colleagues worked to produce another issue of their legal publication, knowing that discovery could mean imprisonment, torture, or death. What drove Camus to risk everything for this dangerous work? It wasn't belief in the ultimate triumph of good over evil. He had seen too much of history to maintain such certainties. It wasn't faith in the perfectibility of human nature. He understood too well humanity's capacity for cruelty. It wasn't even confidence that the resistance would succeed. Victory was far from guaranteed in 1943. Instead, Camus was acting for what he would later describe as revolt. Not political rebellion in the narrow sense, but a deeper form of human refusal. He was saying no to the reduction of human beings to disposable objects. He was saying no to a world that treated suffering as acceptable, that normalized cruelty, that asks people to submit to dehumanization. And in saying no to these negations of human dignity, he was simultaneously saying yes to something precious and irreplaceable, the value of conscious, feeling, vulnerable human existence. This is the paradox at the heart of Camusian revolt. We rebel not because life has ultimate meaning, but because life matters. We fight injustice not because we can prove that justice is cosmically required, but because injustice violates something essential about what we choose to value in human existence. We resist suffering not because we believe the universe forbids suffering, but because we refuse to accept that conscious beings should be indifferent to each other's pain. The nature of authentic revolt, in Camus' understanding, begins with a simple but profound recognition. There are some things that should not be. A child should not starve while others feast. A person should not be tortured for their beliefs. Human beings should not be treated as expendable resources in service of abstract ideologies. Love should not be destroyed by preventable circumstances. Consciousness should not be crushed by forces that could be resisted. These should nots don't derive from religious commandments or philosophical systems or political theories. They emerge from direct human experience, from our capacity to suffer and to witness suffering, to love and see love destroyed, to hope and to watch hope being systematically undermined. Revolt is a refusal to accept these violations of human possibility as normal or inevitable. Consider Dr. Sarah Chun, an emergency room physician working in an underfunded urban hospital. Every shift, she encounters the human cost of social and economic inequalities that are beyond her individual power to address. Children arrive with preventable diseases because their families lack access to basic health care. Elderly patients come in with complications from medications they've been rationing because they can't afford full prescriptions. Young adults present with injuries sustained in violent neighborhoods where desperation has created its own economy. Dr. Chin could respond to these realities with cynical resignation. This is simply how the world works, and individual efforts to change are futile. She could escape into professional detachment. Her job is to treat symptoms, not to address root causes. She could comfort herself with abstract explanations about economic systems or political realities that make these conditions seem inevitable. Instead, Dr. Chin chooses revolt. She refuses to accept that preventable suffering is simply part of the natural order. She fights for every patient with the same intensity, regardless of their ability to pay or their social status. She advocates for policy changes, volunteers at community clinics, and speaks publicly about the health consequences of inequality. She doesn't do this because she believes she can single-handedly solve systemic problems, but because she refuses to be complicit in treating human beings as expendable. Dr. Chen's revolt doesn't require cosmic justification. She doesn't need to prove that the universe demands justice or that history guarantees progress toward equality. Her revolt emerges from something more immediate and more reliable. Her direct experience of human vulnerability and her refusal to accept that vulnerability as a reason for indifference. Rebellion as recognition of shared humanity. What makes revolt truly revolutionary, in Camus' view, is how it reveals a fundamental solidarity of human existence. When we rebel against injustice done to others, we're not just helping specific individuals. We're affirming something universal about the human condition that transcends individual circumstances. Consider Marcus, a teacher in a struggling public school who witnesses daily how poverty, family instability, and social neglect affect his students' ability to learn and thrive. He could focus narrowly on curriculum requirements and test scores, treating educational failures as inevitable products of social circumstances beyond his control. Instead, Marcus chooses to revolt against the assumption that some children matter less than others. He arrives early and stays late to provide extra support to struggling students. He spends his own money on classroom supplies that the school budget can't cover. He advocates for resources and programs that address not just academic needs, but the broader challenges his students face. He refuses to write off any child as unteachable or hopeless, even when external circumstances make success unlikely. Marcus's revolt isn't based on educational theory or political ideology. It emerges from his recognition that each of his students possesses the same essential capacity for growth, curiosity, and dignity that he values in himself. When he fights for their opportunities to develop that capacity, he's simultaneously affirming the importance of those qualities wherever they appear in human existence. This recognition of shared humanity becomes a source of profound connection across differences of race, class, nationality, and circumstance. The wealthy businessman who refuses to exploit vulnerable workers, the privileged student who challenges discrimination against marginalized classmates, the healthy person who advocates for those with disabilities. All are participating in revolt that transcends their immediate self-interest. The rebellion against injustice reveals what Camus called the solidarity of chains, the understanding that threats to human dignity anywhere are threats to the conditions that make human dignity possible everywhere. We don't revolt against others' suffering because we're saints or because we expect cosmic rewards. We revolt because we recognize that indifference to others' pain ultimately makes us less human ourselves. The limits and wisdom of revolt. Camus was careful to distinguish authentic revolt from both naive optimism and destructive fanaticism. Revolt doesn't promise ultimate victory over injustice. It recognizes that injustice is a permanent possibility that requires constant resistance. It doesn't guarantee that individual efforts will solve systemic problems. It insists that individual efforts matter regardless of their ultimate effectiveness. Consider the difference between revolt and revolution as Camus understood them. Revolution often seeks to eliminate injustice permanently by transforming social structures completely, usually through implementing some total vision of perfect society. This approach can lead to fanaticism because it promises final solutions to permanent human problems. It can justify enormous cruelty in service of utopian goals, treating present human beings as expendable resources for future human perfection. Revolt, by contrast, doesn't seek to eliminate the human condition, but to improve it incrementally and continuously. It doesn't promise perfect justice, but fights for better justice. It doesn't claim to solve the problem of suffering permanently, but commits to reducing unnecessary suffering wherever possible. It maintains what Camus called the measure, a sense of proportion that prevents a fight against injustice from becoming another form of injustice. This wisdom appears clearly in the work of people like Rosa Martinez, a social worker who has spent decades helping families affected by addiction and poverty. Rosa has no illusions about eliminating these problems completely. She has seen how complex and persistent they are, how they resist simple solutions, how progress often occurs in frustratingly small increments. But Rosa's revolt against the forces that destroy families doesn't require the promise of final victory. She helps one family at a time, advocates for one policy change at a time, challenges one discriminatory practice at a time. Her effectiveness comes not from believing she can solve everything, but from refusing to let the impossibility of solving everything prevent her from solving something. Rosa's approach embodies what Camus saw as a mature understanding of revolt, the recognition that the fight against injustice is itself valuable, regardless of its ultimate outcomes. The struggle to reduce suffering matters because conscious beings deserve not to suffer unnecessarily, not because we can prove that the universe prohibits suffering. Revolt against death and meaninglessness. Perhaps the most profound form of revolt in Camus' philosophy is a rebellion against death itself. Not the futile attempt to achieve physical immortality, but the refusal to let mortality defeat our capacity for engagement, love, and creation. Consider how differently we might approach relationships if we truly accepted that everyone we love will eventually die, including ourselves. One response might be withdrawal. Why invest emotionally in connections that are doomed to end? Another might be desperate clinging. Try and make temporary relationships permanent through control or possession. But revolt suggests a third possibility. Loving more intensely because love is temporary. Caring more deeply because care is fragile. Connecting more authentically because connection is precious precisely in its vulnerability. The revolt against death involves the refusal to let mortality diminish our capacity for life. This plays out in countless individual choices. The parent who continues reading bedtime stories even though childhood is brief. The friend who maintains loyalty even when loyalty isn't reciprocated. The artist who creates even though artworks eventually crumble. The teacher who educates even though knowledge is forgotten. The healer who tends to others even though all healing is temporary. Each of these choices represents revolt against the logic that says temporary experiences can't be fully valuable, that vulnerable connections aren't worth complete investment, that mortal efforts can't justify passionate commitment. The revolt against death is simultaneously the affirmation of life. Not because life has eternal significance, but because life has immediate preciousness that deserves protection and celebration. The solidarity of shared absurdity. The deepest source of human solidarity, for Camus, isn't shared beliefs about ultimate meaning, but shared experience of the absurd condition. We're all conscious beings seeking understanding in an apparently indifferent universe. We all love people who will die. We all work toward goals that might not be achieved. We all suffer in ways that seem to serve no cosmic purpose. We all face the silence of existence when we ask our deepest questions. This shared absurdity creates what might be called a democracy of human experience. Regardless of our differences in circumstance, culture, or belief, we all participate in the fundamental uncertainties and vulnerabilities that define conscious existence. The recognition of this shared condition becomes a foundation for ethical commitment that doesn't depend on religious authority or philosophical proof. James, a hospice volunteer, experiences this solidarity daily in his work with dying patients. He sits with people from enormously different backgrounds, rich and poor, religious and secular, accomplished and struggling, and discovers that facing mortality reveals something universal about human experience. The specific details vary, but everyone confronts the same basic challenges: how to find meaning in limited time, how to love in the face of loss, how to maintain dignity while acknowledging vulnerability. James's revolt takes the form of refusing to let people die alone or without recognition of their dignity. He doesn't offer false comfort about afterlife rewards or cosmic significance. Instead, he provides genuine presence, authentic attention, and recognition of the preciousness of each person's unique consciousness. His rebellion against indifference becomes an affirmation of the value that consciousness creates simply by being conscious. The ethics of revolt. What emerges from this understanding of revolt is an ethics based not on abstract principles, but on concrete recognition of shared human vulnerability. We should reduce suffering not because suffering is cosmically forbidden, but because we wouldn't want to suffer unnecessarily ourselves. We should protect others' dignity not because dignity is metaphysically guaranteed, but because we know what it feels like to have our own dignity threatened. This ethics doesn't provide final answers to complex moral questions. It offers a way of approaching such questions that remains grounded in immediate human experience rather than abstract theoretical systems. It suggests that our moral commitments should emerge from our capacity for empathy, solidarity, and recognition of shared condition rather than from external authorities or rational calculations. The person living in revolt doesn't need cosmic permission to care about others' well-being or ultimate justification to fight against cruelty and indifference. The caring and fighting justify themselves through the simple but profound recognition that consciousness, encountering consciousness, creates value that doesn't need external validation to be real and important. Saying yes through saying no. The paradox of revolt, that we affirm life by rebelling against life's negations, reveals something essential about human existence. We discover what we value by experiencing what we refuse to accept. We clarify what matters by identifying what should not be tolerated. We create meaning by rejecting meaninglessness, not because we can prove meaning exists objectively, but because the act of rejection itself creates the meaning we seek. Dr. Chen's refusal to accept preventable suffering generates her commitment to healthcare equity. Marcus's rebellion against educational inequality creates his dedication to teaching. Rose's revolt against family destruction produces her passion for social work. James's refusal to let people die unacknowledged becomes his commitment to hospice care. In each case, the no to unacceptable conditions generates a yes to alternative possibilities. The revolt doesn't eliminate the conditions it opposes. Suffering, inequality, destruction, and indifference remain permanent possibilities requiring constant resistance. But the act of resistance itself creates the values, commitments, and connections that make human existence meaningful even within an ultimately absurd condition. This is why Camus could write that there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Not because he promoted despair, but because he understood that choosing to live becomes a foundation for all other meaningful choices. And choosing to live fully requires revolt against everything that diminishes life's possibilities for ourselves and others. We rebel because life matters, not because it is ultimate meaning. And in rebelling, we create the meaning that our rebellion serves. Part 9. The Ethics of Quantity. In the summer of 1957, Albert Camus received a letter from a young Algerian man who had read The Stranger and was contemplating suicide. The man wrote that if life truly had no ultimate meaning, as Camus seemed to suggest, then what was the point of continuing to exist? Why endure suffering, disappointment, and the daily struggle of existence if it all led nowhere significant? Camus' response revealed something essential about philosophy that many readers had missed. He didn't argue that the young man was wrong about life's lack of ultimate meaning. Instead, he suggested that the absence of cosmic significance might actually increase the value of immediate experience. If this life is all we have, if there's no eternal compensation for present suffering, no cosmic justification for current choices, no guarantee of ultimate meaning, then every moment of consciousness becomes more precious, not less. This insight led Camus to what he called an ethics of quantity, a moral philosophy that values the richness and intensity of lived experience over the quality of philosophical justifications for living. It's not that reasons don't matter, but that waiting for perfect reasons before fully engaging with life means missing a life that's actually available to us. Better to live richly without ultimate justification than to live poorly while waiting for cosmic validation. The preference for experience over explanation. Most ethical systems work backward from abstract principles to practical applications. They ask, what can we prove about the nature of good and evil, justice and injustice, meaning and meaninglessness, and then derive guidelines for how we should live based on those philosophical conclusions. Camus suggests we might work in the opposite direction. Start with what we actually experience as valuable, meaningful, and worth protecting, then develop our ethical commitments from those immediate recognitions rather than from abstract theories. Consider Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a pediatric oncologist who has spent 15 years treating children with cancer. She has watched some children recover completely and go on to live full, healthy lives. She has held the hands of others as they died despite every medical intervention available. She has seen families destroyed by grief and others strengthened by their response to crisis. She has experienced the limitations of medical knowledge and the sometimes arbitrary nature of who lives and who dies. From a purely rational perspective, Dr. Rodriguez might conclude that her work is ultimately futile. All her patients will eventually die anyway, if not from cancer, then from something else. She might decide that the suffering involved in treatment sometimes outweighs the benefits, that the resources spent on oncology could be better used elsewhere, that the illusion of medical progress masks deeper questions about the value of prolonging life in a universe that doesn't seem to care whether consciousness continues or ceases. Instead, Dr. Rodriguez chooses what Camus would recognize as the ethics of quantity. She doesn't work to save children because she can prove that human life has cosmic significance. She works to save them because she values the immediate experience of consciousness, their family's consciousness, her own consciousness engaging with theirs. Each additional day of life represents more experience, more possibility, more opportunities for whatever forms of meaning and joy human beings create in their brief time as conscious creatures. Dr. Rodriguez doesn't need perfect philosophical reasons to justify her commitment to reducing suffering and extending life. The commitment justifies itself through the simple recognition that consciousness is rare and precious, that suffering diminishes consciousness's capacity for richness and engagement, and that having more life, more opportunities for experience, connection, creativity, and growth is better than having less, regardless of whether better can be proven in ultimate terms. Quantity as quality. The emphasis on quantity might seem to promote a shallow approach to existence, more experiences regardless of their depth, more activities regardless of their significance, more life regardless of its value. But Camus understood quantity differently. For him, quantity of experience naturally leads to quality of experience when that experience is lived with full attention and engagement. Consider the difference between Maria's two approaches to a typical Saturday. In her first approach, she organizes a day around maximizing productivity and achievement, completing household tasks efficiently, exercising to maintain fitness goals, socializing strategically to maintain important relationships, and consuming entertainment that provides relaxation without wasting time. The day is structured around outcomes and purposes, with each activity justified by its contribution to larger objectives. In her second approach, guided by the ethics of quantity, Maria organizes a day around maximizing richness of immediate experience. She pays full attention to the texture of cleaning, the satisfaction of bringing order to her space, the meditative quality of repetitive tasks, the immediate pleasure of a clean environment. She exercises not primarily for future health benefits, but for the immediate experience of physical capability and embodied consciousness. She socializes not strategically, but with genuine curiosity about others' experiences and perspectives. She chooses entertainment that engages her completely rather than serving as mere distraction. The second approach doesn't necessarily involve more activities. It might actually involve fewer, but it involves more consciousness, more presence, more full engagement with whatever is actually happening. The quantity Camus valued isn't the number of experiences we accumulate, but the completeness of our attention to the experiences we have. This complete attention reveals qualities in ordinary experience that hurried, goal-oriented consciousness typically misses. The taste of food becomes more complex when we're fully present to eating. Conversations become more interesting when we're completely available to listening. Physical activities become more satisfying when we're attentive to the immediate sensations of embodiment. Even difficult experiences, grief, fear, frustration, become more workable when we engage with them fully rather than trying to escape or minimize them. From quantity to compassion. One of the most significant insights of the ethics of quantity is how it naturally leads to compassion rather than selfishness. When we truly value the richness of conscious experience, we begin to recognize that other people's consciousness is just as precious as our own. Their capacity for joy, suffering, growth, and engagement deserves the same protection and support that we want for ourselves. This compassion doesn't emerge from abstract moral reasoning or religious commandments. It develops naturally from the recognition that consciousness is rare, temporary, and inherently valuable wherever it appears. If my own experience of being aware, feeling, and choosing as worth that doesn't need cosmic justification, then the same must be true for everyone else's experience of consciousness. Consider how this plays out in the work of Samuel, a public defender representing clients who are often society's most marginalized people, the poor, the addicted, the mentally ill, those who have made serious mistakes or poor choices. From one perspective, Samuel could view his work cynically. Many of his clients will likely commit future crimes regardless of his efforts. The system is stacked against them, and his individual contributions can't address the larger social problems that create crime and poverty. Instead, Samuel approaches his work through the ethics of quantity. Each client represents a unique form of consciousness with their own experiences, perspectives, and possibilities. Regardless of what they've done or what they might do in the future, they deserve to have their immediate experience of dignity, agency, and hope protected and supported. Samuel fights for each client not because he believes the criminal justice system will become perfect, but because each person's present experience of being treated fairly and having their voice heard has immediate value. This compassion extends beyond professional helping relationships to how we approach all our interactions with other conscious beings. The ethics of quantity suggests that since everyone's experience of consciousness is temporary and precious, we have reasons to support others' opportunities for a rich, engaged, meaningful experience even when doing so doesn't benefit us directly. The responsibility of choosing life. The ethics of quantity carries with it a particular kind of responsibility, not the burden of justifying our existence to external authorities, but the challenge of living up to our own recognition of consciousness's value. If we truly believe that conscious experience is precious, then we have an obligation to ourselves and others to make that consciousness as rich and engaged as possible. This responsibility appears most clearly in how we respond to others' suffering and our own. If consciousness is valuable, then whatever diminishes consciousness's capacity for engagement and growth, poverty, illness, oppression, despair, becomes something we have reasons to resist, not because resistance serves some cosmic purpose, but because consciousness itself deserves protection and support. Consider Lisa, a high school counselor working with teenagers who are struggling with depression, anxiety, and thoughts of suicide. She can't offer her students cosmic reasons for living. She doesn't have access to ultimate truths about the meaning of existence, but she can offer them something potentially more valuable: recognition of the immediate preciousness of their own consciousness, and support for discovering what makes that consciousness feel alive and engaged. Lisa doesn't tell her students that they should live because life has inherent meaning, or because suicide is morally wrong. Instead, she helps them explore what experiences, relationships, and activities make their consciousness feel most vivid and engaged. She supports them in identifying obstacles to that engagement, whether internal like depression or external like family problems, and in developing strategies for addressing those obstacles. Lisa's approach embodies a responsibility that comes with the ethics of quantity. If consciousness is valuable, then we're obligated to help ourselves and others discover how to make consciousness as rich and engaged as possible within whatever constraints we face. This obligation doesn't require us to solve all problems or eliminate all suffering, but it does require us to take seriously the immediate experiences of conscious beings, including ourselves, living without guarantees. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of the ethics of quantity is learning to take full responsibility for choosing life without having guarantees about where that choice leads. Traditional ethical systems often provide comfort by promising that good choices will be rewarded and that living ethically serves some larger purpose that justifies present sacrifices. The ethics of quantity offers no such reassurances. This absence of guarantees can feel terrifying, but it can also be liberating. If we don't need to justify our commitment to consciousness in terms of external rewards or cosmic purposes, then we become free to engage fully with the immediate opportunities and challenges that consciousness presents. Consider how this liberation plays out in creative work. Artists working within traditional frameworks often struggle with questions about whether their work serves important social purposes, contributes to cultural progress, or will be remembered by future generations. These concerns can become paralyzing. Why create anything if you can't guarantee its lasting significance? The ethics of quantity offers artists a different framework. Create because the process of creation engages consciousness in ways that feel alive and meaningful, regardless of external validation or lasting impact. The immediate experience of bringing something new into existence, of engaging creatively with materials and ideas, of expressing unique perspectives through chosen media. These experiences justify themselves through their richness and intensity, not through their contribution to cultural permanence or social utility. The same principle applies to relationships, work, learning, and all other forms of human engagement. We don't need guarantees about permanent outcomes to justify temporary investments. We don't need cosmic validation to make present choices meaningful. We don't need eternal significance to find immediate experience valuable. How to live when tomorrow isn't promised. The practical question that emerges from the ethics of quantity is both simple and profound. How do we live when tomorrow isn't promised, but today is here? How do we engage fully with present experience while acknowledging that present experience is temporary and might end at any moment? The answer isn't to live recklessly or ignore consequences, but to live with what might be called engaged temporariness. Full commitment to immediate experience combined with realistic acceptance of uncertainty about future outcomes. This means caring deeply about people and projects while holding lightly to expectations about their permanence. It means working passionately for causes while accepting that progress might be slow, partial, or reversed. It means loving completely while acknowledging that all relationships end, whether through growth, separation, or death. Consider how David, whom we've met in earlier parts, approaches his relationship with his aging father. David knows that his father's remaining time is limited, a matter of years, possibly less. He could respond to this knowledge by withdrawing emotionally to protect himself from future grief. He could become so focused on his father's eventual death that he misses opportunities for present connection. He could exhaust himself trying to make their remaining time together perfect or comprehensive. Instead, David chooses the ethics of quantity. He spends time with his father not because that time will last forever, but because consciousness connecting with consciousness has immediate value that doesn't need permanence to be meaningful. He listens to his father's stories not because they'll be preserved for eternity, but because the sharing of experience between generations represents one of the forms that human richness naturally takes. He expresses his love openly not because love conquers death, but because love is one of the experiences that makes consciousness feel most fully alive. This approach doesn't eliminate David's grief about his father's mortality, but prevents that grief from diminishing his capacity for present connection. The ethics of quantity suggests that awareness of endings can intensify our engagement with what exists now rather than paralyzing us with anxiety about what we'll eventually lose. The democratic nature of quantity. One of the most beautiful aspects of the ethics of quantity is how democratic it becomes an application. Since everyone possesses consciousness, everyone's experience has the same basic kind of value. This doesn't mean all experiences are identical or that all choices are equally good, but it does mean that every person's capacity for rich, engaged, conscious living deserves protection and support. This democratic understanding appears in how we approach social justice, healthcare, education, and all other collective efforts to improve human conditions. We work to reduce poverty not because we can prove that economic equality serves cosmic justice, but because poverty diminishes people's opportunities for rich, engaged experience of consciousness. We support education not because we can guarantee that learning serves ultimate purposes, but because education expands consciousness's capacity for growth, creativity, and engagement. The ethics of quantity doesn't solve all ethical dilemmas or provide easy answers to complex social problems, but it offers a foundation for approaching these challenges that remains grounded in immediate human experience rather than abstract theoretical commitments. It suggests that our ethical choices should emerge from recognition of consciousness's immediate preciousness rather than from external authorities or ultimate justifications. More life as moral imperative. What emerges from this understanding is a gentle but profound moral imperative. Given that consciousness is rare, temporary, and inherently valuable, we should support conditions that allow consciousness to flourish rather than merely survive. This means working to reduce unnecessary suffering, to expand opportunities for growth and creativity, to protect people's capacity for love and connection, and to resist forces that diminish consciousness's richness and engagement. This imperative doesn't require cosmic justification to be compelling. It emerges naturally from honest recognition of what consciousness is and what threatens or supports its capacity for richness. The ethics of quantity suggests that more life, more opportunity for experience, growth, connection, and engagement is better than less, not because we can prove this philosophically, but because consciousness appreciating consciousness creates its own values that don't need external validation. In choosing life fully, we choose responsibility for making that choice as rich and engaged as possible, both for ourselves and for the other conscious beings whose experiences intersect with our own. This responsibility is both burden and gift. It places the weight of creating meaning squarely on human shoulders, while simultaneously revealing that humans are remarkably capable of creating meaning when they choose to do so completely. Part 10. The Joy of Sisyphus. The alarm pierces through the morning silence at 6:30 a.m. on a Monday in March. Your hand reaches out to silence it, just as it did in the opening of our journey together. But something has changed in that familiar gesture. The weight is still there. Existence hasn't become lighter or easier. The questions remain. Life hasn't suddenly revealed its cosmic purpose. The uncertainty continues. Tomorrow still isn't guaranteed, and ultimate meaning remains as elusive as ever. Yet, this Monday morning feels different. Not because the external circumstances have changed, but because your relationship to those circumstances has been transformed. The alarm isn't just a mechanical demand to endure another day. It's an invitation to engage with another opportunity for conscious experience. The approaching week isn't just a repetitive burden to be shouldered. It's a collection of moments that won't occur exactly this way again. The familiar routine isn't just meaningless repetition. It's the texture of a human life being lived in real time. This transformation isn't the result of finding better answers to life's fundamental questions. It's the result of discovering that we might have been asking the wrong questions altogether. Instead of what's the ultimate meaning of existence, we've learned to ask, how can I live fully within conditions that actually define existence? Instead of why should I continue living, we've discovered, how can I make the choice to continue living as rich and engaged as possible? The Monday morning revolution. Consider how differently this Monday morning unfolds when approached through the lens of Camusian wisdom. You wake not because you have to, but because consciousness returning each day is itself a small miracle worth experiencing. The coffee you drink becomes not just caffeine delivery, but an opportunity for presence. The warmth, the aroma, the way morning light transforms familiar spaces. The commute becomes not just time to endure, but consciousness moving through the world, witnessing other conscious beings beginning their own days of engagement with existence. Sarah, the attorney we met earlier, might find that her legal work takes on different significance when approached through the ethics of quantity rather than the search for cosmic purpose. She doesn't need to believe that her corporate litigation serves ultimate justice to find satisfaction in doing the work well, in engaging skillfully with complex problems, in exercising capabilities that consciousness has developed over years of practice. The immediate experience of competence, creativity, and professional engagement justifies itself without requiring eternal validation. The cases she wins won't be remembered by history, and the problems she solved will be replaced by new problems. But the process of wrestling with difficult questions, of advocating for clients, of engaging with other legal minds, these experiences of consciousness encountering challenging material represent forms of aliveness that don't need cosmic significance to be valuable. Michael, who had chosen spiritual death through numbness and routine, might discover that even familiar activities can become opportunities for presence when approached with full attention. Making breakfast becomes not just meal preparation, but consciousness engaging with immediate physical needs. Walking to work becomes not just transportation, but awareness moving through the world, noticing changes in season, architecture, and human activity. The work itself, even if it's not his dream job, becomes opportunity for whatever forms of engagement and competence are available within its constraints. Michael doesn't need his job to be his calling in order to find ways to do it with craftsmanship and attention. He doesn't need his colleagues to be his best friends in order to treat them with genuine regard. He doesn't need his workplace to be perfect in order to find moments of satisfaction, humor, and connection within its imperfections. Practical wisdom for daily living. The insights we've explored throughout this journey translate into specific practices that can transform ordinary experience without requiring extraordinary circumstances. These practices aren't spiritual disciplines or self-improvement techniques. They're simply ways of living that emerge naturally from taking seriously the preciousness of consciousness and the reality of the absurd condition, the practice of presence. This involves giving complete attention to whatever is actually happening rather than dividing consciousness between present experience and mental commentary about that experience. When Lisa, the school counselor, sits with a student who is sharing their struggles, she doesn't need that conversation to solve all the student's problems in order to be fully present to what the student is experiencing right now. The immediate meeting of consciousness with consciousness has value that doesn't depend on perfect outcomes. Presence transforms routine activities by revealing richness that distracted consciousness typically misses. Washing dishes becomes an opportunity to engage with texture, temperature, and the satisfaction of creating cleanliness. Waiting in line becomes a chance to observe human behavior, to practice patience, or simply to rest in awareness without needing to be constantly productive. The practice of rebellion. This involves a quiet but persistent refusal to accept despair, indifference, or cruelty as inevitable features of existence. When Dr. Chen encountered preventable suffering in her emergency room work, her rebellion takes the form of treating every patient with the same intensity of care, regardless of their social status or ability to pay. She doesn't need to believe she can eliminate all suffering in order to commit fully to reducing the suffering in front of her. Rebellion can be as simple as refusing to participate in conversations that diminish other people's dignity, or as complex as organizing community efforts to address social problems. It can involve challenging one's own habits of cynicism and withdrawal, or supporting others who are struggling to maintain hope and engagement. The common element is the refusal to let the recognition of life's difficulties become an excuse for reducing our commitment to life's possibilities. The practice of solidarity. This involves recognizing and acting on our fundamental connection with other conscious beings who face the same basic challenges we do. The need to find meaning without cosmic guarantees, to love in the face of loss, to maintain dignity while acknowledging vulnerability. Thomas, the social worker helping families affected by addiction, practices solidarity not by pretending to have all the answers, but by recognizing that he shares with his clients the fundamental human challenge of creating meaningful lives within difficult circumstances. Solidarity appears in how we listen to others' experiences, how we support their efforts to grow and heal, and how we share our own struggles without either self-pity or false bravado. It involves treating others' consciousness as precious as our own, not identical to our own, but equally deserving of protection, support, and opportunity for richness. The art of living without ultimate justification. What emerges from these practices is what we might call the art of living without ultimate justification. The ability to engage fully with existence while acknowledging that existence doesn't provide cosmic reasons for engagement. This art doesn't eliminate the fundamental questions about meaning and purpose. It transforms our relationship to those questions. Consider how Elena, the philosophy student, might approach her graduate studies differently after embracing the absurd condition rather than trying to escape from it. She doesn't need philosophy to provide final answers to ultimate questions in order to find philosophical inquiry deeply engaging. The process of thinking carefully about difficult problems, of encountering different perspectives on fundamental issues, of developing her own capacity for analysis and insight. These experiences justify themselves through their immediate richness rather than through their contribution to eternal human knowledge. Elena's research doesn't need to revolutionize philosophy to be worthwhile. Her teaching doesn't need to transform all her students to be meaningful. Her writing doesn't need to achieve lasting recognition to be valuable. Each of these activities represents consciousness, engaging with challenging material in ways that feel alive and worthwhile, and that immediate aliveness is sufficient reason for commitment. This approach extends to relationships, creative projects, community involvement, and all other forms of human engagement. We don't need relationships to be permanent in order to love completely. We don't need creative projects to achieve recognition in order to find creation satisfying. We don't need community work to solve all social problems in order to find collaboration with others rewarding. The transformation of suffering, one of the most profound changes that occurs when we embrace the absurd condition, is how we relate to suffering, both our own and others. Traditional approaches often try to explain suffering as serving some cosmic purpose, or to minimize it through various forms of distraction or denial. The absurd approach neither explains suffering away nor pretends it doesn't matter. Instead, we learn to see suffering as one of the fundamental conditions of consciousness that deserves neither cosmic justification nor complete elimination. Maya, the hospice nurse, doesn't need her patients' deaths to serve some ultimate purpose in order to find meaning in reducing their pain and supporting their dignity during the dying process. The immediate relief of suffering matters because conscious beings matter, not because suffering serves cosmic plans. This approach makes us both more realistic about suffering's inevitability and more committed to reducing unnecessary suffering wherever possible. We don't expect to eliminate all forms of pain, loss, and difficulty from human existence. But we also don't accept current levels of preventable suffering as inevitable or acceptable. The absurd approach to suffering involves what we might call engaged acceptance, fully acknowledging difficult realities while maintaining commitment to improving what can be improved. David, caring for his aging father, doesn't pretend that aging and death aren't painful realities. But he also doesn't let awareness of those realities diminish his capacity for present love and attention, living forward without ultimate destinations. Perhaps the most liberating aspect of embracing the absurd condition is how it frees us from the burden of needing to know where we're going in order to move forward thoughtfully. Traditional approaches to life often require clear goals, definite purposes, and confidence about desired outcomes before justifying significant commitments or efforts. The absurd approach suggests that we can move forward intelligently based on immediate recognitions of what enhances or diminishes consciousness, what increases or decreases possibilities for richness and engagement, what supports or threatens the conditions that allow consciousness to flourish. We don't need ultimate destinations to make thoughtful choices about directions. Rosa, the social worker helping families affected by addiction and poverty, doesn't need to know that her work will eventually eliminate these social problems in order to commit fully to helping the families in front of her. She can make intelligent decisions about which interventions seem most promising, which approaches align with her values, and which strategies make the best use of available resources, all without needing guarantees about ultimate outcomes. This forward movement without ultimate destinations allows for a kind of flexibility and responsiveness that goal-oriented approaches often lack. When we're not attached to specific outcomes, we can adjust our methods based on what we learn through experience. When we're not dependent on external validation, we can experiment with approaches that feel authentic to our own recognition of what matters, the joy that requires no justification. This brings us back to Sisyphus, walking down the mountain after watching his boulder roll back to bottom, facing the prospect of beginning his endless task once again. In Camus' revolutionary interpretation, this is the moment when Sisyphus becomes most human and most free, when he's most fully conscious of his condition and most capable of choosing his response to that condition. The joy that Camus asks us to imagine Sisyphus experiencing isn't the happiness of someone whose dreams are coming true. It's the deeper satisfaction of someone who has learned to find the process of engaging with existence sufficient reason for choosing existence. The boulder will always roll back down, but the walking down the mountain can be experienced fully. The task will always remain unfinished, but the engaging with the task can be done with complete attention and even pleasure. This joy doesn't depend on external circumstances aligning with our preferences. It emerges from full engagement with whatever circumstances we actually face, approached with consciousness, choice, and commitment to making the best of conditions that define our existence. Janet, the teacher in the struggling public school, might experience this joy when she sees a student suddenly understand a concept they've been working on together. The understanding might not last. The student might forget it by next week. The school system might remain troubled by problems beyond Janet's power to solve. But the immediate moment of consciousness, recognizing consciousness, of learning happening in real time, of human potential actualizing itself however briefly, this experience carries its own sufficient joy. The point of living so fully that reasons become irrelevant. Our journey through Camus' philosophy brings us to a final insight that transforms not just how we answer life's questions, but how we relate to the questioning itself. The point isn't to find a reason to live, but to live so fully that reasons become irrelevant. This doesn't mean that thinking about life's meaning becomes unimportant. Philosophical reflection remains one of the forms that human consciousness naturally takes, but it means that the thinking serves the living rather than the living serving the thinking. We reflect on existence in order to live more skillfully, more engagingly, more completely, not because we need perfect understanding before we can justify engagement. When we live with full presence, active rebellion against despair, and genuine solidarity with other conscious beings, we discover that the living itself provides whatever justification consciousness requires. The taste of coffee doesn't need cosmic validation to be worth experiencing fully. The love we feel for family and friends doesn't need eternal guarantees to be worth expressing completely. The work we do doesn't need ultimate significance to be worth doing well. The Monday morning alarm becomes not a demand to justify our existence, but an invitation to experience existence as richly as possible. The approaching week becomes not a burden to be shouldered, but an opportunity to engage consciously with whatever forms of challenge, connection, creativity, and growth present themselves. This is the joy of Sisyphus, not the happiness of someone who has solved all problems, but the deep satisfaction of someone who has learned to live fully within the problems that define the human condition. The boulder keeps rolling back down the mountain, but we keep choosing to walk back down and begin pushing again, not because we must, but because consciousness engaging with existence, however absurd, is the most remarkable thing we know how to do. In that choosing, in that walking, in that pushing, in the fullness of presence we bring to whatever tasks and relationships and challenges define our particular version of the human experience, we discover that life doesn't need to justify itself to us. Through the simple but revolutionary act of living it completely, we justify ourselves to life.